Hello, everyone. Welcome to Literary Travels with River. Today, we're bringing you a summary of the first book in the thrilling Throne of Glass series by Sarah J. Maas. Join Celaena Sardothien, a young assassin, in her fight for freedom and a deadly tournament that could change her destiny. Remember, this is just a summary. If you want to enjoy the full story, don't forget to read the entire book. Chapter 1. Celaena Sardothien had spent a year in the brutal salt mines of Endovier, a place where prisoners were subjected to forced labor and barely managed to survive. Her reputation as Adarlan's most feared assassin ensured she was watched more closely than the others, always guarded by a larger escort. However, that day, something different was about to happen. As she was led through the intricate corridors of a building, a hooded man dressed in black gripped her arm tightly. Celaena noticed they were trying to disorient her with unnecessary turns and detours, but she, ever observant, wasn't fooled. On the contrary, every step she took allowed her to better understand the structure of the place. The figure beside her, tall and fit, concealed his face, but she sensed his menacing and enigmatic presence. As they advanced, Celaena realized that this man wasn't just any guard, but Cale Westfall, the captain of the Royal Guard. His unexpected arrival sent a long-forgotten sensation of fear coursing through her, though the young assassin didn't let it show on her face. She recalled the days when her beauty and strength were her pride, but now, after months of slavery, her body and spirit were marked by hardship. The corridor they walked through was long and silent. The only sound echoing was that of their own footsteps. As they delved deeper into the building, Celaena began to formulate hypotheses about why she was there. Perhaps they were going to execute her, she thought, since a high-ranking officer like Cale Westfall wouldn't bother visiting her for anything less. Her sharp mind analyzed the possibilities and considered how she might escape if things went awry. Finally, they arrived at a majestic hall with golden and red glass doors. With a creak, the doors opened to reveal an imposing throne room, illuminated by a massive crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling. At the front, on a wooden throne, a handsome young man waited. Celaena stood still, stunned, as the guards and the royal guard captain himself bowed before him. That young man was none other than the Crown Prince of Adarlan, an encounter she never would have imagined in such a place and under such circumstances. Her mind, which had been anticipating death, was now filled with questions and a growing fear of what would come next. Chapter 2. Celaena Sardothien found herself in the presence of the Crown Prince of Adarlan, Dorian Haviliard, and the young captain of the guard, Cale Westfall. Cale, with a firm gesture, removed his hood, revealing his face. Though he was young, his appearance showed a determination that made Celaena feel a mix of surprise and caution. When Dorian, seated on the throne, asked if she was the assassin he had heard so much about, Celaena made no bow, an insolence that did not go unnoticed. The tension in the room became palpable, and a guard, identified as Duke Parrington, brutally threw her to the ground, forcing her to bow. Celaena felt the cold marble against her cheek, her body aching from the mistreatment, but she did not give an inch in her pride. As the Duke held her down, Dorian, his voice laced with distant boredom, ordered the Duke to stop his abuse. Parrington, irritated but obedient, released her and left the hall, leaving Celaena alone with the prince and his captain. Despite the circumstances, Celaena stood up, showing the dignity she had left, and faced Dorian's gaze, who observed her with a mix of curiosity and fascination. Although Celaena was aware of the pitiful state she was in, she didn't allow shame to dominate her. The prince, with his intense blue eyes and regal bearing, examined her as if she were a subject of study, intrigued by the famous assassin who now stood before him as a mere slave. Dorian, in a casual tone, commented on her appearance, asking why she hadn't been bathed before her audience. Cale explained that he wanted to avoid keeping the prince waiting, which earned a mild rebuke from Dorian, but he let the matter drop to focus on Celaena. He formally introduced himself, detailing his lineage with an air of self-sufficiency that did not go unnoticed by Celaena. He also remarked on how surprising it was that someone so young and disheveled-looking was the legendary assassin of whom so many stories were told. Intrigued by her survival in Endovier, Dorian asked how she had managed to live so long in a place where the life expectancy didn't exceed a month. Celaena, with her usual sarcasm, responded with irony, which provoked a reaction of astonishment and amusement in the prince. The conversation then turned to an escape attempt Celaena had made months earlier, in which she had killed several sentries before being recaptured. Dorian, interested in hearing more details, was surprised by Celena's bravery and skill, recognizing how improbable her feat had been. The prince, wanting to see the scars that covered her back, ordered her to turn around. Celaena, though angry at the request, complied. Dorian examined her skin, finding several scars, but what caught his attention most were her eyes, which shone with a unique intensity despite the dirt that covered her. As he observed her closely, Celaena fought the impulse to attack him, aware that she was in an extremely vulnerable position, but also knowing that he and Cale wanted something from her. Finally, Dorian revealed the reason for her presence in Endovier. He had not come just to examine her, but to make her a proposition. Celaena, though surprised, remained calm, aware that any opportunity, no matter how small, could be the key to her freedom. Thus, controlling her internal agitation, she responded firmly, ready to hear what the Crown Prince had to offer. Chapter 3. The prince's eyes gleamed with amusement as he observed Celaena, who, despite her disheveled appearance, maintained a defiant attitude. The prince, without taking his eyes off her, ordered the guards to leave them alone, except for Cale, who remained in place. As Celaena watched the doors close, she wondered what plan they were hatching and why they acted so recklessly by leaving her practically unprotected. Dorian laughed at Celena's brazen attitude, warning her that her freedom was at stake and that she might want to be more cautious. This surprised Celaena, who did not expect to hear such a word. Freedom. In her mind, an image formed of snow-covered landscapes, distant seas, and cliffs, a vision of a world she barely remembered. The prince explained that his father, the King of Adarlan, needed a champion, someone to do the Empire's dirty work. The idea of being the king's personal assassin was absurd to Celaena, but Dorian offered her a deal. If she agreed to serve as the king's champion for 6 years, she would gain her freedom. If she refused, they would send her back to the salt mines of Endovier, where she would surely die. However, there was a condition. The king wasn't offering her the position directly. First, she would have to earn the title by competing against other thieves, assassins, and warriors from across Aurelia. Only if she won would she prove to be the best and officially become Adarlan's assassin. Celaena, her pride wounded, questioned who her rivals would be and why she couldn't compete under her real name. Dorian explained that no one knew the infamous assassin of Adarlan was actually a young woman and that her identity had to remain hidden. This enraged Celaena, who realized that the name and reputation she had fought so hard for did not truly belong to her. Despite her anger, the prince insisted that they needed her skill to win the competition and offered her a negotiation. If she agreed to fight for him and won, he would reduce her service time to 5 years instead of 6. Celaena, with a mix of desperation and cunning, bargained to be freed in 3 years, but Dorian only agreed to reduce it to 4. Though Celaena was trading one form of slavery for another, she accepted the deal, knowing this was her best chance to regain her freedom. Finally, Dorian warned her that if she lost, they would send her back to Endovier, where she would likely die soon. Celaena, faced with this possibility, agreed on the condition that she be given the chance to prove she was still the best. Dorian, satisfied with her decision, ordered Cale to take her to her quarters so she could prepare for the journey to Rifthold. As Celaena was led out of the room, her mind filled with the hope of regaining her freedom. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was willing to do anything to achieve it, even face her worst rivals and walk through hell itself. Chapter 4. Celaena Sardothien, after the intense meeting in the throne room, tried to rest on a bed that, although comfortable, felt strange to her after so much time sleeping in inhuman conditions. Her body, marked by scars and still fresh wounds, found no solace, despite being freed from shackles. She recalled the relief of feeling the manacles being loosened from her wrists, though the pain still lingered in her joints. The soft mattress and clean clothes felt alien to her. She remembered the unpleasant moment during dinner when her stomach, unaccustomed to normal food, rejected the chicken she tried to eat. Although she wanted to regain her strength and former splendor, her skeletal body and gaunt face in the mirror reminded her of how far she was from being the assassin she once was. Finally, exhausted, she found comfort in the promise that in Rifthold, she could regain her vigor. The next morning, Cale Westfall entered the room and was surprised to find Celaena sleeping on the floor, wrapped in a blanket. When she got up, her eyes were immediately drawn to the sunlight filtering through the curtains, a sight she hadn't enjoyed in a long time. The warmth of the sun on her skin, though pale and marked, filled her with renewed hope. After the maids had tidied her up, Celaena dressed in a refined riding habit that concealed her thinness. She delighted in the feel of the fabric against her skin and the promise of being able to enjoy beautiful clothes again if she won the competition. As they walked through the corridors toward the main courtyard, her spirits lifted, but they quickly deflated as she remembered the cruel reality of the slaves still working in the mines of Endovier. Upon reaching the caravan, Celaena was greeted by 3 of the Crown Prince's black dogs, who approached her eagerly. Dorian, who had followed the animals, remarked with a smile on how the dogs seemed to have a strange interest in her. Celaena, keeping her composure, responded with disdain, which only provoked a playful response from the prince. Though irritated, Celaena found herself momentarily enjoying the attention before being led to the company of soldiers waiting for them. Riding a dapple gray mare, Celaena felt free for the first time in a long while, though her enthusiasm was quickly tempered by the cold reality when Cale placed the manacles on her again, chaining her to her horse. As the caravan set off, the young assassin noticed the watchful eyes of the guards, aware of her potential danger. Despite the chains, Celaena couldn't help but feel a growing excitement as they left Endovier, her prison, behind. During the journey, as they advanced into the oak-walled forest, Celaena tried to engage Cale in conversation, seeking to gather information about the political situation and the king's campaigns. Though Cale initially ignored her, Celaena persisted with questions about his personal life, attempting to provoke him and elicit some reaction. Eventually, she managed to get a few short answers out of him, though the captain remained largely reserved and distant. Celaena, however, was not discouraged. Her sharp wit led her to keep probing into Cale's life, and though he tried to remain firm, she enjoyed her role as provocateur. When they reached a clearing in the forest, the caravan stopped to eat. Cale, pulling the chain that bound her to him, ordered her to dismount. Though Celaena obeyed, her mind was constantly thinking of possible ways to escape and how to take advantage of every opportunity to regain her freedom. Chapter 5. Celaena, aware that her only chance at freedom lay in getting rid of Cale, decided not to act hastily. She knew that, even if she were chained, She might have tried something if they had been alone. However, facing the entire royal guard surrounding them was an impossible task. So, she let herself be led to the clearing where the group was preparing to eat. Kale, always alert, stayed close to her while the other soldiers lit a fire and prepared the meal. When she was finally served a plate, Celaena, hungry, grew impatient when Kale didn't immediately remove her shackles. With a warning glance, he reluctantly agreed to free her hands, though he quickly chained her ankles. Celaena, resigned, began eating slowly to avoid upsetting her still weak stomach. She observed her surroundings while the soldiers conversed among themselves, noting that Dorian, the crown prince, sat apart with Duke Parrington. Though the prince had shown a carefree attitude the night before, he now seemed tense and irritated in the Duke's presence, indicating that their relationship was not exactly friendly. While eating, something in the forest caught Celaena's attention. The atmosphere suddenly changed, and everything became quieter and more mysterious. The trees, adorned with leaves that looked like jewels, evoked a supernatural beauty that remained intact despite Adarlan's conquests. Celaena recalled her childhood and the moment when Arabin Hamel had rescued her from the edge of a frozen river. Under his tutelage, she had become the most feared assassin, but she had also lost the chance to return to her home in Terrasen, a kingdom the king of Adarlan had ravaged. Now, nostalgia and bitterness overwhelmed her as she gazed at the beauty of Oakwald, a forest that still resonated with echoes of ancient power. A soldier in the group broke the silence with a disrespectful comment about the forest, and others joined in, mocking the legends surrounding Oakwald. Celaena, unable to contain herself, intervened, reminding them that the forest had belonged to King Brannon, a being of the Fae people. Though the soldiers laughed, Celaena knew the truth. The forest still held the memory of magical times when supernatural creatures inhabited it. Though magic had disappeared years ago, the weight of its absence was still felt in Aurelia. Captain Kale, intrigued, asked Celaena what she knew about the forest, but she decided not to reveal everything she knew. Though she shared a bit of the story, she omitted crucial details, aware that knowledge was power. The soldiers, disappointed at not finding more to mock, returned to focusing on their meal. For the rest of the day, the caravan continued its journey, delving deeper into the forest. The atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive for Celaena, whose body was exhausted after hours of riding. By nightfall, she was so tired that she didn't even protest when they chained her again and forced her to sleep under guard. However, when she woke the next day, something extraordinary surprised her. Her cot was surrounded by small white flowers, and tiny footprints, like those of a child, entered and exited the tent. Fearing that someone else might notice, Celaena hurriedly erased the footprints and hid the flowers, feeling uneasy about the prodigy she had just witnessed. Though no one mentioned what had happened, Celaena couldn't help but feel a growing tension throughout the day. She cautiously observed the faces of the soldiers, looking for signs that any of them had seen the same thing. As they advanced, her thoughts focused on the mysteries of Oakwald Forest and the legends that, though relegated to oblivion, seemed to have a persistent echo in the present. Chapter 6. For the next 2 weeks, the caravan crossed the continent under increasingly hostile weather. The nights grew colder, the days shorter, and a freezing rain lashed them for 4 endless days. Despite her resilience, Celaena felt the cold seeping into her bones, and on more than one occasion, she considered the idea of throwing herself off a cliff and dragging Kale with her. With wet hair and soaked feet, each night she was forced to wrap her numb fingers in any dry fabric she could find, fearing they would rot from the cold and dampness. However, as often happens in autumn, the rain abruptly ceased, and the sky returned to being clear and bright. Celaena was dozing on her mare when Prince Dorian approached, trotting elegantly, his red cape billowing in the wind like a crimson wave. With his refined cobalt blue doublet and high leather boots, the prince was the image of aristocratic perfection, though his jeweled hunting knife seemed an excessive accessory. When Dorian caught up to Chaol, he ordered him to accompany him to the top of a nearby hill, indicating that they should bring Celaena with them. Though the young assassin was furious at being treated like an object, she had no choice but to follow them. As they climbed the steep hill, the setting sun illuminated an impressive glass castle that appeared before them, the Castle of Rifthold. The gigantic structure, with its gleaming spires like needles reaching toward the sky, was a masterpiece of Adarlan. Celaena couldn't help but feel small in the face of such a display of power and wealth. She recalled the first time she had seen the castle, 8 years earlier, and how she had considered it a monument to bad taste and a waste of resources. That day, the memories of her past, of the life she had left behind, intertwined with the present, filling her with a mix of nostalgia and disdain. As Dorian and Chaol discussed the upcoming audience with the king, Celaena couldn't take her eyes off the castle. She knew that returning to Rifthold wouldn't be easy, and the uncertainty about her future tormented her. Chaol noticed her concern and commented on the irony of her expression, as if instead of freedom, the gallows awaited her. Celaena, lost in thought, confessed her suspicions that someone close to her had betrayed her before her capture. Despite her success as an assassin, she had always had enemies, and betrayal wasn't something that surprised her, though she wasn't yet ready to face that truth. The conversation shifted to the horrors Celaena had endured in Endovier. In a low voice, devoid of mockery, Chaol expressed his empathy for the suffering she had experienced. Celaena, feeling she had nothing to lose, told him about the tortures and humiliations she had endured, how the overseers had treated her with special cruelty, and how only the kindness of some Islwi prisoners had prevented her wounds from becoming infected. After her confession, Chaol remained silent, and the rest of the day passed without further exchanges between them. That night, Celaena woke up startled by a recurring nightmare. She saw herself buried alive in a mass grave in Endovier, struggling to escape from a sea of decomposing corpses. The horror of the dream left her trembling, with cold sweat soaking her back. As she tried to calm down, her gaze fell on the glass castle, which glowed in the darkness with a greenish tint, like a lurking monster. She knew that the next day she would be locked within those walls, but for now, she enjoyed the deceptive peace that preceded the storm. Wrapping herself in her cloak, Celaena decided that she would win the competition, serve the king, and then disappear. She had no desire to reign again in that city, where magic had died and the Fae people had been banished or executed. She was no longer destined for anything grand. Not anymore. At a distance, Dorian watched Celaena from the other end of the camp. He saw her sitting in silence, with her legs drawn up and the moonlight bathing her silver hair. The sadness that emanated from her figure moved him, and for a moment, he stopped seeing her as the dangerous assassin she was. However, he quickly reminded himself that she was there to fight for him, to win her freedom, and nothing more. With that thought in mind, Dorian lay down, keeping one hand on the hilt of his sword, and fell asleep. But the image of Celaena, sitting under the stars, haunted his dreams throughout the night. Chapter 7. The entourage passed through the imposing alabaster walls of Rifthold as the heralds announced their arrival. Red banners with golden wyverns waved over the capital, and the cobblestone streets were clear, with no sign of vehicles. Celaena, unchained, dressed, and made up, shared a mount with Chaol as she wrinkled her nose at the city's stench, a mix of spices, horses, garbage, and blood, all combined with the salty smell of the Avery River. Prince Dorian, wrapped in a red cloak and with a golden crown on his head, greeted his people with a smile that radiated authority. A group of girls welcomed him enthusiastically, but their expressions changed when they noticed Celaena in the royal entourage, mistaking her for a lady of high birth. Aware of the envious glances, Celaena smiled and waved, which earned her a pinch from Cale, who warned her to behave normally. The caravan advanced through the commercial district, where crowds gathered between the trees lining the wide avenues. The shop windows filled with dresses, jewelry, and hats sparked a voracious hunger in Celaena, but her attention shifted to the imposing glass castle towering over the city. As she gazed at the structure, the young assassin felt increasingly alienated from the pomp and luxury surrounding her. When they reached the pier, the sounds of commercial bustle mixed with the creaking of ropes and nets from the ships. When Celaena heard the crack of a whip, she turned and saw a group of slaves staggering as they disembarked from a merchant ship. They were prisoners of war, accused of practicing magic, or simply unfortunate people caught at the wrong time. The sight of those slaves reminded her of her own experience in Endovier, and a deep anguish overwhelmed her, wishing to scream that she wasn't part of the court and that she had also suffered alongside them. But before she could react, the entourage reached the castle gates. As they passed through the glass arch, the castle rose majestically before them, and Cale dismounted to help Celaena. The young woman's legs trembled as she contemplated the 600 rooms, the gardens, the nature reserve, and the stables that made up Prince Dorian's home. The magnificence of the place was overwhelming, and though Dorian tried to joke about the fragility of the glass castle, Celaena couldn't hide her discomfort at the thought of what awaited her inside those walls. Dorian left her in Cale's care, who guided her to her quarters in the stone wing of the castle. Celaena's accommodations were larger than she could have ever imagined. A bedroom with a bathroom, a small dining room, and a music room. The furniture in red and gold tones, along with a huge tapestry covering one wall, gave the place a luxurious touch. But as Cale quickly showed her the space, Celaena couldn't stop counting the windows, exits, and guards stationed around. She knew that every detail was crucial for a possible escape. When left alone, Celaena began to inspect every corner of the room. Though she found no weapons, she improvised one with some pins and a string, knowing that every small resource could be useful. Then, she explored the game room, observing the billiard cues and heavy balls, thinking about how they could serve her if she needed to escape. After a brief nap, Celaena was interrupted by the arrival of a tailor and later by a maid named Philippa Spindlehead, who would be her personal servant. Philippa, a stout woman with a strong character, was not intimidated by Celaena's reputation. Though the assassin tried to assert her authority, Philippa made it clear that she expected her to behave like a lady while under her care. Elsewhere in the castle, Prince Dorian was in a tense meeting with his father, the King of Adarlan. Despite the king's severity, Dorian defended his decision to choose Celaena as his champion for the tournament. However, the king was not convinced of the assassin's loyalty, warning his son about the dangers of trusting someone like her. Dorian tried to challenge his father, but the king struck him, reminding him that, though he was his son, he was still his king and should obey without questioning orders. With his face flushed with anger and pain, Dorian left the throne room, aware that any further challenge would only put him in danger. Even so, the image of Celaena, sitting silently under the moonlight, persisted in his mind, a vision that would haunt him throughout the night. Chapter 8. Celaena walked down a long marble hallway, her dress billowing behind her in an elegant blend of purple and white. Beside her, Cale walked with firm steps, always with a hand on the hilt of his sword, ready for any eventuality. As they strolled through the corridors, the assassin curiously asked if there was anything interesting at the end of the path. Cale, somewhat impatient, reminded her that they had already visited the gardens, the ballrooms, the historic rooms, and the best views from the stone castle. Unless she wanted to venture into the glass castle, there was nothing else to see. Celaena, with her arms crossed, had managed to convince Cale to let her explore the castle, taking advantage of every moment to map out possible escape routes. Though the captain didn't understand her reluctance to enter the glass building, Celaena insisted that the idea of walking on glass floors made her nervous, despite Cale's assurances about the material's strength. When she asked if there wasn't some kind of menagerie or library they could visit, a melody from a harp filtered through the closed doors, piquing Celaena's curiosity. Cale explained that it was coming from the quarters of Queen Georgina Haviliard. Celaena, ever astute, took the opportunity to extract more information, though Cale seemed unaware of what he was revealing to her. As they continued their walk, a sudden burst of sound caught Celaena's attention. It was the clock from the tower, a structure of black stone decorated with menacing gargoyles. The tower, with its dark numbers and hands that resembled swords, seemed a twisted vision, and she was surprised to learn that the king had it built to commemorate Dorian's birth. As they advanced, Celaena noticed a mark engraved on a slab along the path, a peculiar symbol that captured her attention. Though Cale dismissed it as mere decorative adornment, the assassin couldn't shake the feeling that the gargoyles seemed to be pointing to that symbol in particular. However, Cale insisted they continue their walk, finally leading her to a monumental library. As they passed through the dragon-adorned oak doors, Celaena was amazed by the vast space filled with books, 1 million volumes, according to Cale, with rumors of a second hidden library underground. To Celaena, the library was a paradise, a city built of leather and paper. She let herself be carried away by the excitement, exploring the shelves filled with unknown titles. Cale, surprised by her enthusiasm, reminded her that those books belonged to the king and that she needed permission to read them, but Celaena, determined, didn't let that discourage her. That night, after a solitary dinner, Celaena devised a plan. She wrote a formal note to Prince Dorian, requesting access to the library. With her characteristic sarcasm, the letter reflected both her wit and her desire to challenge the rules. To her surprise, Dorian responded quickly, sending her 7 books from his personal collection, along with a note inviting her to read them so they could discuss them later. Delighted, Celaena immersed herself in one of the books, enjoying the reading until she fell asleep. The next day, she woke with a start at the sound of the tower bells. She got out of bed, and not finding any trace of Cale, she stepped out onto the balcony. From there, she observed the autumn landscape, with golden and brown trees scattered across the garden. She waved to the guards watching her from below, aware that she could knock them out with a few heavy books if she wanted to. As Celaena gazed at the city of Rifthold, she noticed a group of 3 women approaching a nearby fountain. The woman in the center, dressed in red, seemed to be the leader, and her conversation, though superficial, caught Celaena's attention. The woman arrogantly spoke about her relationship with Dorian, referring to the prince's whore dismissively, not knowing that Celaena was listening from the balcony. Determined not to let that comment go unnoticed, Celaena pushed a flower pot from the balcony, which fell near the women, causing quite a commotion. As the maids tried to clean the mud from the woman's dress, Celaena retreated to her quarters, laughing to herself. The flower pot hadn't hit its target, but it was a sufficient warning. With a mischievous smile, she prepared for the rest of the day, determined to face any challenge that came her way. Chapter 9. Celaena couldn't help but smile as she looked at her reflection in the rosewood mirror. The dress she was wearing was a masterpiece. White lace, delicate as sea foam, adorned the deep neckline, blending with the soft pastel green silk that made up most of the dress. A red sash, in the shape of an inverted peak, cinched her waist, separating the bodice from the impressive cascade of skirts and petticoats that extended below. The bodice, decorated with pale green gemstones and bone-colored brocade, concealed a small dagger that Celaena had improvised. Though the weapon dug into her chest, she hardly cared. She was too busy admiring her appearance in the mirror. As she continued adjusting the final details of her outfit, Celaena had no clear plan of what she would do next. She would likely have to change before the competition began, but that didn't concern her at the moment. It was then that she heard a soft rustling behind her and saw Philippa, her maid, enter the room. The assassin tried not to appear vain, but she couldn't help it entirely. Philippa, always direct, commented that it was a shame that Celaena was who she was. Otherwise, she could attract the attention of a knight for marriage, and with some charm, she might even win over the prince. As she spoke, Philippa knelt to brush Celaena's ruby-red shoes. The conversation soon turned to the rumors circulating in the court about the supposed interest of the crown prince in her, but Philippa, with her usual wisdom, predicted that those rumors would fade within a week once Dorian set his sights on another woman. Celaena, with a sardonic smile, tried to sit down, but Philippa stopped her just in time, warning her that she would wrinkle the dress fabric. Celaena complained about the shoes, which were terribly painful, and the discomfort of the corset, but the maid was adamant. Still, when Cale burst into the room, his abrupt entrance interrupted the conversation. Panting, he was left speechless at the sight of her, clearly impressed by her appearance, though he quickly tried to hide it. Without giving many explanations, Cale ordered Celaena to accompany him upstairs. Philippa protested, worried that Celaena might trip over the dress, but the captain was too rushed to stop. As they hurriedly climbed the stairs, Celaena stumbled several times over the dress, and her shoes tortured her with every step. Cale explained that they were going to see the king, which left her stunned and caused a wave of nervousness. As they walked, Cale gave her clear instructions on how to behave in front of the king. Celaena was to make a deep curtsy, keep her head high and back straight, and under no circumstances should she look the king in the eyes or respond defiantly. Otherwise, she might face the gallows. The reminder of the king's absolute power made her recall her trial, where she had felt a similar oppression, a desperate desire to escape, even through death. When they finally reached the hallway leading to the throne room, Cale noticed that Celaena was pale and visibly affected. He tried to reassure her, reminding her that the meeting was only to introduce the champions and explain the tournament's rules, not to put her to the test. Though his words were comforting, the tension still gripped her. Just before entering the hall, Cale stopped and, in a moment of unexpected sincerity, told Celaena that she looked very beautiful. The assassin, surprised by the comment, felt her pulse calm a bit. With that final exchange of words, she lifted her chin with determination and, along with Cale, entered the crowded hall where she was expected. Chapter 10. The first thing Celaena saw as she entered was the floor, red marble with white veins, illuminated by the sun's rays filtering in until the frosted glass doors closed with a faint creak. Around her, the hall was filled with hanging chandeliers and flickering torches. There were no windows, only a large glass wall that looked out at the sky, offering no escape. There was barely one way out, the door behind her. To her left, a huge fireplace occupied almost the entire wall, with a gaping maw of threatening fangs in which green flames burned, sending a shiver down Celaena's spine. Cale guided her to the center of the room, passing by the crowd that watched her. She struggled to remain calm as she made a deep curtsy, feeling the eyes on her. When she stood up, she felt the pressure of Cale's hand on her back, signaling her to move forward, where Dorian Havillard awaited her. The prince, impeccably dressed in a red and gold jacket, showed a brief expression of surprise at seeing her so elegantly dressed, but quickly replaced it with a sardonic smile. Celaena could barely return the smile, too worried about the trembling in her hands. Finally, the King of Adarlan spoke. His harsh, deep voice filled the room, making Celaena feel her bones creak under the weight of his words. Despite being at a considerable distance, Celaena only dared to look at the king up to his chest, observing his imposing bearing. He wore a white fur cloak and a sword sheathed at his side, with a wyvern carved on the hilt, the feared Nothung, a sword that never forgave. The king explained the reason for the gathering, mentioning that they had all been brought to serve the kingdom, but Celaena barely listened. She was more concerned about the other competitors filling the room. 23 men stood between her and her freedom. Most seemed gigantic, but when she observed their faces marked by scars and a lack of apparent intelligence, she felt slightly relieved. However, one of them, a young man with gray eyes, watched her intensely. Though his appearance wasn't particularly impressive, something in his gaze piqued Celaena's curiosity. Then, her eyes turned to a massive man next to Duke Parrington, Kane, whose intimidating presence and muscles seemed made of steel. Though his face wasn't unpleasant, his presence and cruel smile unsettled her. The king continued to explain the competition's rules. Each week, there would be a test that would eliminate one of them until only 4 remained for the final battle during Maas. Celaena did the math. 13 weeks to defeat them all and win her freedom. 13 weeks to endure the tests, eliminations, and grueling training. When the king mentioned that some might die in the process, Celaena felt a knot in her stomach. She had no other choice. She had to win. The king demanded loyalty and gratitude from everyone present. Celaena, along with the other champions, muttered a grateful submission while avoiding the king's gaze, which seemed fixed on her. The monarch reminded them that their loyalty must be above all else and that any failure would be severely punished. He then dismissed them without further ceremony. Celaena and Cale quickly left the hall, while the other competitors and their sponsors remained talking among themselves. As she walked away, Celaena felt the tension leave her, replaced by a sense of relief. Cale finally relaxed the hand on her back and commented that at least she had managed to keep her mouth shut. Dorian then appeared, leaning against a wall with his usual smile. After a brief exchange of words with Cale, he turned to Celaena to apologize for his father's abruptness. Celaena, still processing the tension of the meeting, barely responded. Dorian explained the plan to keep her identity a secret. In court, she would be known as Lillian Gordina, a reformed jewelry thief chosen by the prince. Celaena nodded, accepting the fabricated story, though it seemed unlikely to her. The group continued walking but was interrupted by Lady Kaltain, the woman Celaena had seen in the gardens. Kaltain, visibly interested in Dorian, paid little attention to Celaena, who stayed in the background. The conversation was tense and loaded with insinuations, but Dorian handled the situation with his characteristic charm, visibly irritating Kaltain. After a brief exchange, Dorian politely excused himself, leaving Celaena and Cale alone with Kaltain. When Kaltain finally left, Cale commented that Celaena seemed to have enjoyed herself, to which she responded with a touch of sarcasm. As they neared Celaena's quarters, the conversation lightened, and they even shared a few laughs at Kaltain's expense. When they arrived, Cale said goodbye, reminding her that the tournament began the next day and that she should rest. Celaena closed the door to her quarters with a smile on her lips, enjoying the moment and the relief of having overcome the first obstacle. Chapter 11. Celaena jolted awake as Cale burst into her room, forcing her to get up. The cold dawn enveloped her as she groaned and demanded her slippers, but the captain gave her no respite, insisting she needed to get ready. The hearty breakfast waiting for her in the dining room barely lifted her spirits, and though she tried to enjoy it, her mind was already on the competition about to begin. Cale, impatient, urged her to hurry, while she tried to stay calm and hide her fatigue caused by a night spent reading. Though Cale was surprised by her decision to write to the prince to request books, Celaena explained that, as his champion, she had certain privileges. However, the captain wasn't convinced that was enough to justify her behavior. As breakfast progressed, Celaena began to worry about what awaited her in the tournament, especially since she didn't know what challenges they would face. She decided to dress appropriately for any eventuality, though she wasn't pleased with the simple clothing Cale ordered her to wear. Despite her complaints, the captain quickly led her to the barracks, where the atmosphere was tense and all the competitors were preparing for combat. The atmosphere in the large hall where the tournament would take place was charged with anticipation. The other champions were already training under the watchful eyes of their sponsors. Cain, the most feared warrior among them, made an imposing entrance, throwing a taunt at Celaena that she calmly responded to, though inside, she was seething with anger. Cale, observing everything intently, challenged her to demonstrate her sword skills. Though Celaena initially seemed nonchalant, as soon as the duel began, the assassin unleashed her dexterity and agility, moving with the precision of a dancer in a fierce battle. But Cale was no easy opponent. He was strong, fast, and very skilled. Despite Celaena's speed and grace, the captain managed to knock her down with a clever strike, leaving her without her sword. With Cale's sword pointed at her chest, Celaena reluctantly accepted her defeat, but her competitive spirit was not extinguished. When the captain suggested she choose another weapon to continue, Celaena confidently selected some hunting knives, smiling at the prospect of a new showdown. The assassin was determined to prove that, though Cale had won that battle, the war had only just begun. Chapter 12. Just as Celaena was about to attack Cale with her knives, a spear strike echoed in the hall, calling everyone to silence. The firm voice belonged to Theodos Brullo, a short, stocky man tasked with being the judge of the competition. Brullo, with years of experience in the castle, made it clear that it would be hard to impress him. Though he was not the final judge, the king was. Brullo began interrogating the competitors, asking them to introduce themselves. Cain, a soldier from the White Fang Mountains, was the first to speak, followed by Xavier Forel, a master thief from Melisande. The variety of participants was impressive. Soldiers expelled from the army, notorious thieves, and ruthless assassins, all gathered to compete for the title of the king's champion. Among these assassins, two particularly sinister figures stood out: Bill Chastain, known as the Aerator, who delighted in devouring his victims' eyes, and Ned Clement, nicknamed Scythe, famous for torturing and dismembering priestesses. Both, with skin hardened by years of forced labor, seemed to have emerged from a hell they should never have returned from. Grave, a short assassin with a macabre smile and brown teeth, was another competitor who caught Celaena's attention as she sensed he was vile and dangerous. When it was her turn to speak, Celaena, using her alias of Lillian Gordina, introduced herself as a mere jewelry thief from Belhaven, eliciting laughter from some of the competitors. However, beneath her disguise of apparent insignificance, Celaena held herself back, knowing she could defeat any of them if she chose. Brullo ordered a break before the next activity, a race to measure the champion's physical condition. As everyone dispersed, Cale took the opportunity to talk to Celaena. Though she felt insulted at having to hide her true identity, Cale explained that it was better not to stand out and to stay under the radar to avoid becoming a target. Celaena, though annoyed, acknowledged the wisdom in the captain's words and decided to follow his advice. The race began, and the group of competitors shot off through the nature reserve. Celaena struggled to keep a steady pace, recalling Cale's instructions. Cain, surprisingly fast, led the race, while Celaena fought not to fall behind. Despite the pain in her lungs and the exhaustion she felt, she kept pushing forward, determined not to give up. When they finally crossed the finish line, Brello ordered them to hydrate before continuing with the training. However, Celaena, feeling dizzy and sick, slipped away into the forest, pretending to have lost a ring. Once out of sight of the others, she vomited from the extreme exertion. Cale, watching from a distance, said nothing as she composed herself and returned to the group, keeping her moment of weakness a secret. Chapter 13. At lunchtime, Brello gave them the rest of the day off, and Celaena eagerly devoured her meal. She was in the middle of tearing into meat and bread when Cale entered the dining room and took a seat across from her. He had changed clothes and taken a bath, looking more relaxed. Seeing Cale serve himself a portion of salmon, Celaena wrinkled her nose in disgust, confessing her aversion to fish. Cale, in a teasing tone, remarked that despite her combat skills, her manners left much to be desired. Celaena expected Cale to mention her vomiting episode during the race, but he avoided it. Instead, they talked about books, exchanging titles and literary preferences, and the time flew by until the clock struck 1. Cale stood up, leaving Celaena the afternoon off, and she responded by requesting a bath and planning to spend the afternoon reading on her balcony. At dawn the next day, Cale found Celaena training intensely, doing pull-ups on the door beam of her room. The assassin, drenched in sweat, continued her workout with determination, intent on regaining her physical form. Though Cale was surprised to see her so dedicated, he couldn't help but smile in response to hers. Later, a storm broke out, and Cale allowed Celaena to accompany him on a walk around the castle after finishing their daily training. Celaena, delighted to wear one of her new dresses, chose a lilac silk one with lace details and pearl embellishments. However, their walk was interrupted when, rounding a corner, they encountered Celaena Sardothien, who was accompanied by Princess Nehemia of Islwey. Nehemia, a dazzling and elegant woman, wore a loose white dress that contrasted with her bronze skin, adorned with gold and ivory jewelry. Beside her, 2 armed guards watched Celaena and Cale warily. Celaena introduced Princess Nehemia, who observed Celaena with suspicion. Surprisingly, Celaena spoke a few words in the Islwey language, earning a smile from the princess and leaving the others perplexed. As they conversed in Islwey, Celaena realized Nehemia's sharpness and strength, who expressed disdain for both the castle and her guide, Celaena. Nehemia showed clear contempt for the Adarlan court and especially for Dorian, the crown prince, whom she described as too flirtatious for her taste. Intrigued by the princess's presence in Rifthold, Celaena asked about her stay. Nehemia explained that she had been sent by her father, the king of Islwey, to learn the customs and language of Adarlan, though her tone hinted at latent discontent. As the conversation continued, Nehemia revealed that after Adarlan's invasion, nearly all the books in her country had been destroyed, which deeply affected Celaena, who shared the pain of losing access to knowledge and history. The conversation between the 2 women flowed naturally, and Nehemia, recognizing a kindred spirit in Celaena, asked her to keep her company during her stay in Rifthold. Celaena accepted, surprised and honored by the princess's request. Finally, Cale interrupted to take Nehemia to the king's council, and the princess, though with a gesture of resignation, agreed. Before leaving, Nehemia took Celaena's hand, revealing calluses on her fingers, which aroused Celaena's suspicions about the rumors linking Nehemia to the Islwey rebels. Returning to her quarters, Celaena, dressed in a simple robe, devoured her food while Cale watched her in silence. Despite her arrogance and peculiar behavior, Cale couldn't help but find her intriguing. However, he remained alert, aware that beneath Celaena's charming surface lay a darkness that would sooner or later emerge. The assassin was an enigma, and Cale knew he had to be prepared for anything. Chapter 14. For the next 4 days, Celaena maintained a strict training routine, waking up before dawn to exercise in her room. She used everything she had at hand: chairs, the billiard table, even the billiard balls, to improve her balance. Chaol would usually appear at breakfast time, and then they would run together through the nature reserve, with Chaol adjusting his pace to the assassins. Autumn had fully arrived, filling the air with the scent of dry leaves and the chill of impending snow. Chaol silently observed each time Celaena vomited her breakfast after running, noting that, as the days passed, she could run further without stopping. After running, they trained in a private room, where Celaena practiced until she was exhausted. Her favorite weapons were knives, though she also enjoyed using a wooden club that allowed her to hit Chaol without causing real harm. Though she had encountered Princess Nehemia once, she hadn't heard from her since, not even through the maids. Training continued in the afternoons when Celaena joined the other champions under Brello's supervision. Though she tried not to draw attention, she couldn't help but detest Kane, who seemed to be Brello's favorite and the center of respect among the other competitors. Celaena was annoyed that no one noticed her own progress, and even more so that Kane was constantly provoking her. With the first elimination test around the corner, the uncertainty about what awaited them began to weigh on her mind. The day before the test, something felt wrong from the start. Chaol didn't show up for breakfast, sending guards instead to escort Celaena to the training room. The absence of Chaol left her uneasy and filled with unanswered questions. In the training room, Celaena stayed close to a column, watching as the other competitors arrived accompanied by their guards and trainers. The tension in the air was palpable. Knox Owen, a young and talented thief, approached her, exchanging comments about Chaol's absence. When Celaena mentioned that the captain hadn't trained with her that morning, Knox shook her hand, showing a friendly attitude. The conversation was interrupted when Pelaer, the youngest of the assassins, quietly informed them that one of the champions, Bill Chastain, the aerator, had been found dead that morning. The news of his death, described brutally, spread quickly among the competitors, creating an atmosphere of fear and speculation. Celaena, unsettled, decided to distract herself by practicing with throwing knives, demonstrating her skill by repeatedly hitting the bullseye. Knox, impressed by her dexterity, asked for some tips, which she generously shared. The calm was interrupted by Varen, who, from the ring where he was training with Kane, hurled a vulgar taunt at Celaena. Though Knox tried to calm her down, Celaena felt a growing anger, channeling her frustration into each knife throw. Despite the tensions, she managed to keep her composure, but she couldn't shake the growing unease at the possibility that something similar to what had happened to Chastain might happen again. Later, on the balcony of her quarters, Celaena was surprised when Chaol appeared, sitting beside her as she read. The conversation soon turned to more personal topics. Chaol, visibly tired, mentioned that he had had a difficult day, dragged into a long council meeting by Dorian. Though he tried to talk about books, Celaena couldn't help but ask about the aerator's murder, but Chaol remained reserved. The conversation grew more intimate as Chaol shared details of his past, revealing that he had grown up alongside Dorian in the castle before renouncing his title of Lord of Aniel to become captain of the guard. Celaena, in turn, shared a painful memory of her training with Arabin Hamel, mentioning how she had broken her right hand to improve her dexterity with her left. The brutality of her past left Chaol thoughtful. Finally, Chaol reminded Celaena that the first test would be the next day, and though she claimed to be ready, both knew the road ahead would be difficult. As Chaol said goodbye, Celaena was left reflecting on the stories they had shared, feeling a strange bond with the captain despite the differences that separated them. In the stillness of the evening, with the cold wind brushing the ruffles of her dress, Celaena wondered what the future held and whether she was truly prepared to face it. Chapter 15. Though Celaena would never admit it, the uncertainty about her first test made her uneasy. After 5 days of intense training, her body was sore, but she strove to hide the discomfort. When she entered the gigantic training hall with Cale, she noticed that the other competitors seemed equally anxious, all wondering what awaited them behind the enormous black curtain that divided the room. Whatever was hidden there would determine the fate of one of them. The atmosphere, normally bustling, was now filled with whispers and tension. The competitors stayed close to their trainers, while the sponsors watched from the mezzanine above. Among them was Prince Dorian, whose gaze briefly met Celaena's. Though he smiled at her, she quickly looked away, focusing on the curtain. Brello, his scarred hand resting on the hilt of his sword, stood next to the curtain, waiting for the right moment. Before he could say anything, Nox appeared at her side, making a comment about the theatricality of the situation. Celaena, aware that Cale was tense, responded to Nox with an ironic smile, expressing her relief that things were finally getting interesting. The clock struck 9 and Brello, with an authoritative tone, announced that the first test was about to begin. The curtain slowly drew back, revealing 5 targets distributed across the room. It would be an archery competition. Celaena stifled a laugh as she realized what the test was. The task seemed simple: shoot 5 arrows, 1 at each target, and the worst shooter would be eliminated. As the competitors lined up to choose their bows, Cale stopped her, warning her not to show off too much. Celaena promised to try, though her smile suggested she wasn't very convinced. The test began, and one by one, the competitors shot their arrows. Some were skilled, others less so, but all tried their best. As the line moved forward, Celaena observed the others, including Kane, who shot with a precision that made her blood boil. His arrogance was palpable, and the attention he received from Brello and the sponsors only increased Celaena's frustration. Finally, it was her turn. As she stepped up to the white line, she felt all eyes on her. She drew the bow, feeling the pain in her muscles, and released her first arrow. It hit the target accurately, though not in the center. With each shot, she demonstrated her skill by strategically aiming away from the center until she reached the last target, the farthest one. Focusing on the small black at the center, she drew the bowstring once more, ignoring the laughter of a mercenary. As she released the arrow, it flew across the room and struck the exact center, erasing the black. Silence filled the room. No one dared laugh again. After everyone had finished, Brello reviewed the results. Against some expectations, it wasn't the young Pelayer who was eliminated, but a soldier from the army. Though Celaena hadn't lost, she couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't really won anything. Despite her success in the test, the sense that there was still much to face was inescapable. Chapter 16. Despite her efforts to control her breathing, Celaena was panting as she ran alongside Cale through the nature reserve. Though the captain was also sweaty, he showed no signs of fatigue, which only increased Celaena's frustration. As they ran toward a hill shrouded in mist, Celaena's legs trembled and her stomach churned. Unable to continue, she stopped and leaned against a tree, vomiting the breakfast she had eaten earlier. Cale, standing nearby, watched her without saying a word. Between retches and tears, Celaena tried to steady her breathing. 3 days had passed since the first test and 10 since her arrival in Rifthold, but she still felt out of shape. With the next elimination test just 4 days away, she had intensified her training, waking up earlier each day. She wasn't going to allow Kane, Renaud, or anyone else to outdo her. When Cale finally spoke, it was to scold her for eating before running, which prompted a sarcastic response from Celaena. Though she tried to move toward him, her legs gave out, and she had to lean against the tree again. The captain, noticing the scars on her back, asked when she had received them. Celaena, bitterly, replied that she had gotten them on her first day in Endovier, explaining how she had received 21 lashes for no reason other than being who she was. Chaol, his voice hoarse, asked if anyone had tried to take advantage of her in Endovier, but Celaena, with a bitter smile, explained that the guards were too afraid of her to try. Despite the horrific conditions, she had found ways to protect herself and survive, making it clear that she wouldn't let anyone dominate her. Chaol nodded, unsure how to respond to her story, before Celaena, determined, resumed running up the hill. The next day, in the afternoon, the champions were gathered around Brullo, who was talking to them about different weapons. Celaena, bored, began to mentally disconnect until a sudden movement at the balcony doors caught her attention. One of the champions, a soldier expelled from the army, had pushed a guard, knocking him unconscious, and was attempting to escape into the gardens. But before he could reach the glass door, an arrow pierced his neck, killing him instantly. The room fell silent as the guards surrounded the champions, their hands on the hilts of their swords. Even Cain, normally arrogant, remained still. Chaol and some guards rushed to the body of the dead champion, Sven, but no one dared to move. Nox, standing next to Celaena, murmured his surprise, quietly wondering why someone would take such a risk, especially knowing the tournament rules were so strict. Celaena reflected on Sven's escape attempt, questioning his motives. Why try it at that moment and not wait until night? She recalled her own experience in Endovier, where she had decided to rebel, not to escape, but to prove she still had power over her life. Perhaps Sven had done the same, choosing death over a life of slavery and control. As the sunlight illuminated the blood on the floor, Celaena silently prayed for the fallen champion, wishing him good luck on his final journey. Chapter 17. Dorian Havillard was trying to stay awake as music and conversation filled the court's grand hall. His mother insisted that he attend these social events, though he found that even a weekly visit was more than enough. It was better than inspecting the aerator's corpse, which Chaol had been investigating over the past few days. Dorian preferred not to worry too much, trusting that Chaol would handle any problems that arose, though the scene of the champion who had attempted to escape that afternoon had disturbed him. The prince couldn't help but wonder what his father was thinking when he organized that competition. His mother, Queen Georgina, sat beside him, oblivious to the true nature of the champions residing in her palace. Her face, still beautiful, showed signs of age, and her outfit of green velvet, adorned with golden shawls and a sparkling veil, seemed exaggerated. Dorian felt like just another accessory in that scene, dressed in an ensemble chosen by his mother that included a teal velvet vest and gray trousers. Though he wore the clothes with dignity, he couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort. The queen, noticing his expression, commented on a letter she had received from her younger son, Holland, complaining about school. Dorian, trying to maintain his composure, replied that Holland was better off at school, recalling with disdain how troublesome his younger brother was. The conversation soon turned to the topic of marriage. The queen insisted that Dorian, at 19 years old, needed to marry soon to secure an heir to the throne. She mentioned Princess Nehemia of Alwi as a possible candidate, though more in jest, aware that the princess was not to her husband's liking, the king. Dorian, however, found Nehemia intriguing, having heard rumors of her support for the rebels and her efforts to shut down the Calaculla labor camp. Georgina suggested other possible brides, including Lady Caltaine, who, to Dorian's dismay, was watching him with interest from across the hall. As his mother continued proposing ladies of the court, Dorian couldn't help but feel increasingly trapped and bored. Everything in his life, from the women around him to the political matters, had become monotonous and predictable. Finally, the queen handed him a list of potential wives, each with noble blood and of marrying age. Dorian, feeling suffocated, took the list without protest and stood up to leave the hall. Though 5 ladies immediately surrounded him, trying to capture his attention, he politely excused himself and walked away through the castle corridors. As he walked, with no clear destination in mind, Dorian stopped outside the champion's training room, from which the metallic sound of swords emerged. To his surprise, there was Celaena Sardothien, facing off against 3 guards with astonishing skill. Her golden hair shone with effort, and her turquoise eyes reflected determination. Dorian watched her, impressed, until he saw Princess Nehemia approaching, clapping. Nehemia, dressed in a dark tunic and loose trousers, carried an ornate wooden staff and approached Celaena with a smile as if they shared a friendship. Confused and irritated, Dorian approached them, wondering where Cale and Brullo were. After bowing to Nehemia, he took Celaena's hand, and though it smelled of sweat and metal, he kissed it while asking about Cale. Celaena, with her usual sarcasm, explained that the captain was probably busy investigating the Aerator's corpse or the body of Sven, the champion who had attempted to escape. Dorian, even more annoyed, asked what Nehemia was doing there, training with weapons. Celaena replied that the princess had insisted on meeting her, and that, as a woman, Nehemia understood the need to be armed. When Dorian tried to forbid Nehemia from training, Celaena told him that she was a princess and could do whatever she wanted. Finally, Dorian resigned himself and offered to train with Nehemia, who accepted enthusiastically. Despite the tension, Dorian couldn't help but notice how beautiful Celaena was, even when trying to challenge him. With a sigh, Dorian prepared for the training, determined not to be outdone by the assassin or the princess. Chapter 18. Celaena watched from a distance as Prince Dorian taught Nehemia the basics of sword combat. Though there was some arrogance in his teaching style, there was also a genuine tenderness she couldn't ignore. It bothered her how Dorian, with his presence, managed to make her feel both uncomfortable and attracted. It was impossible not to notice how handsome he was, which led her to wonder why he wasn't already married. In fact, she surprised herself by wanting to kiss him, an impulse that shook her as she remembered Sam, the assassin she had grown up with and who had been the last to kiss her before his death. Meanwhile, Nehemia surprised Dorian with a well-aimed strike to his wrist, causing him to wince in pain. Celaena couldn't help but chuckle to herself as she saw how the princess reveled in her small victory. However, the moment was abruptly interrupted when Cale grabbed her arm, pulling her aside roughly. He wanted to know why Dorian was training with Nehemia, to which Celaena responded with disinterest. The conversation between them grew tense, and Cale, visibly upset, decided it was time for Celaena to return to her quarters, despite her protests about needing to train for the next day's test. Celaena tried to resist, feeling frustrated and trapped by the restrictions being imposed on her. She argued that she needed more training, especially given her deteriorated physical condition after being a prisoner in Endovier, but Cale remained firm. As the argument escalated, Celaena expressed her discontent, not only with the situation but also with the constant surveillance, orders, and the feeling of always being under control. Finally, in a fit of rage, she declared that she couldn't stand Cale, to which he, unfazed, calmly responded, ending the discussion. Upset and wanting to get back at him somehow, Celaena stormed off, leaving a charged atmosphere behind her. Chapter 19. Celaena sat in the grand hall, watching from her chair by the fireplace as Duke Parrington spoke with Queen Georgina on the dais. She was frustrated that Dorian had hurriedly left an hour earlier, just as she had spent the morning preparing to impress him. With her dark hair styled in an elegant bun and a dress that, though it constricted her, looked splendid, she had hoped to catch the prince's attention. However, it was the unexpected presence of Duke Parrington that captured her interest instead. When Parrington finished his conversation with the Queen and headed for the doors, Celaena intercepted him, greeting him with a forced smile to hide the disgust she felt for him. The Duke, with a gesture she found unpleasant, offered her his arm, which she accepted with a feigned smile. As they walked together, they exchanged trivialities, but Celaena subtly tried to pry into his conversation with the Queen, aware that her position at court largely depended on the Duke's influence. As they talked, Celaena reminded herself that she wasn't at court just to enjoy its pleasures, but with a goal in mind, to elevate her position and ensure that she, not someone else, became the future queen. When she mentioned the list of potential brides for Dorian, Parrington made it clear that Lady Lillian, Celaena's alias, was not included, which gave Celaena a moment of relief. However, she decided to manipulate the Duke by making him believe that Dorian had deep feelings for Lillian, which sparked the Duke's ire. Celaena saw this as an opportunity. If Parrington hated Lillian so much, he could become a powerful ally in eliminating her competition for the crown. After a tense conversation, the Duke bid Celaena farewell, hinting at a possible nighttime encounter, which left her with a knot in her stomach. However, she was determined to continue using the Duke to get closer to Dorian and remove any obstacles in her path to the crown. Meanwhile, Dorian and Chaol were walking to dinner, briefly discussing recent events. Nehemia was safely in her quarters, but the fact that Celaena had trained with her had been a cause for concern for Chaol, who considered Dorian's absence irresponsible. The conversation grew tense when Chaol expressed his worry about Dorian's relationship with Celaena, reminding him that, though she was attractive and intelligent, she was still an assassin. Dorian dismissed his concerns, assuring him that there was no reason to fear Celaena, as she had shown no intention of escaping or killing so far. Despite the tension between them, Dorian changed the subject and asked about the investigation into the recent murder of one of the champions, known as the Aerator. Chaol, visibly affected by the brutality of the crime, explained that the body had been dismembered and stripped of its organs, a fact that disturbed Dorian. However, Dorian tried to downplay the matter, suggesting it could have been the result of a drunken brawl, though fear was beginning to take hold in his mind. Trusting in Chaol's abilities to solve the case, Dorian led his friend to the dining hall for dinner. Chapter 20. Celaena closed the book with a sigh of disappointment. She had expected more from the ending, but now, with that emptiness in her mind, she stood up and began to wander around her quarters. She felt uneasy about what had happened with Chaol during her training with Nehemia. She hadn't been able to apologize, and though she hated being cruel, the captain of the guard had awakened something in her that she couldn't ignore. As she walked, she realized she had made a mistake by mentioning the vomiting. Did Chaol really trust her or despise her? Trying to distract herself, Celaena began to worry about the next day's test and the mysterious death of one of the champions. She had taken precautions, adjusting the hinges on her doors so they would creak when opened and hiding needles in a bar of soap, improvising weapons in case the champion killer decided to visit her. Still uneasy, she headed to the music and games room. She had no company to play with, but the pianoforte called to her with an almost irresistible force. She approached the instrument carefully, remembering the days when music was a fundamental part of her life. She used to play for Arabin Hamel, who insisted that she delight him with her music. Now, as she sat before the piano, memories of those times, along with the painful memory of Sam, flooded her mind. She began to play a slow and melancholic melody, almost like an echo of her memories. As her fingers glided over the keys, the music flowed from her soul, bringing with it a mix of emotions, healing and opening old wounds at the same time. As Celaena played, Dorian appeared in the doorway, paralyzed by the beauty and sadness of the music. He couldn't help but approach, and as he sat beside her, he tried to start a conversation. However, his presence interrupted the moment, and Celaena, surprised, became defensive. The tension between them became palpable as they exchanged words, and though Dorian tried to joke and keep the conversation light, Celaena didn't let him forget the reality of who she was, the assassin of Adarlan. The exchange between them grew deeper when Dorian mentioned her skill at playing the pianoforte, suggesting that someone with so much talent couldn't be just a criminal. However, when he hinted at the possibility of Celaena having a secret lover, he touched a sensitive nerve. The pain in Celaena's eyes was evident as she finally revealed that her lover, Sam, had died 13 months ago, leaving her devastated. Dorian, moved by the revelation, apologized, but the damage was done. Celaena, however, accepted his sympathy with a resigned sadness. As they parted, Dorian wished her luck in the next day's test, but he couldn't stop thinking about the heartbreaking music he had heard, nor the shadow of pain he had seen in Celaena's eyes. Chapter 21. Celaena hung from the castle's stone wall, her legs trembling as she wedged her pitch-covered fingers and feet into the cracks between the massive stone blocks. Brello, the instructor, shouted orders from below to the 19 champions climbing alongside her, but the wind howling at 20 meters high drowned out his words. One of the champions hadn't shown up for the trial, and no one knew where he was. Perhaps he'd decided to flee rather than face the deadly challenge ahead. The goal was simple, yet terrifying: climb the wall to reach a golden flag fluttering 30 meters up. The first to reach it and return would win the trial, while the last to arrive would be eliminated. Although the path to the flag was dotted with balconies and ledges, the ascent was perilous. Celaena, with her aching fingers, moved cautiously, recalling the endless hours she had spent under Arobyn's tutelage, where he forced her to confront her fear of heights. Cain led the competition, closely followed by Tumba, Varen, and Nox. Each competitor had chosen a tool to aid them in the climb. While Cain had opted for a rope, Celaena had chosen a pot of pitch. With her sticky hands and feet, she managed to adhere to the stone and progress safely, though she chose a more difficult route to avoid the other competitors, knowing that some wouldn't hesitate to push her off if given the chance. Midway through her ascent, Celaena heard a scream followed by a dull thud. Looking down, she saw the corpse of Ned Clement, an assassin known as Scythe, who had fallen from a great height and now lay lifeless on the ground. This incident didn't seem to bother the sponsors, who watched the trial from below, eager to see who would survive. As she climbed, Celaena observed Cain using his rope to bypass a dangerous section, further increasing his lead. Tumba, in an attempt to follow him, caused a bottleneck that complicated the ascent for the other competitors. Varen pushed past him easily, while Nox, behind Tumba, struggled to advance. Celaena, meanwhile, continued to climb, now closer to the flag. Then she heard Nox scream. Looking down, she saw Tumba pushing him, leaving him dangling from his rope. The situation became even more dangerous when Tumba pulled out a hidden dagger and began cutting Nox's rope. Though Celaena knew she needed to focus on her own ascent, she couldn't ignore what was happening. With fierce determination, Celaena slid down a drain pipe, ignoring the pain from the metal tearing at her hands and feet. She landed on the head of a nearby gargoyle and took the mercenary's rope, threatening him not to interfere. She tied the rope around her waist and, in an act of pure bravery, ran along the backs of the gargoyles and leaped into the void, determined to save Nox before the rope snapped completely. Chapter 22. The wind roared around Celaena as she dove after Nox, who was plummeting out of control. Despite the blinding light reflecting off the castle's crystal walls, she kept her eyes fixed on him, watching as he flailed his arms desperately, as if trying to fly. In an instant, her hands grabbed his waist, colliding with him so hard it nearly knocked the wind out of her. They fell rapidly, their descent accelerating toward the ground. Nox clung to the rope with all his might, but the impact was still brutal when the rope tightened, abruptly halting their fall and slamming them against the castle wall. Celaena took the brunt of the hit on her shoulder and side, struggling to maintain her grip on Nox as they dangled precariously 10 meters above the ground. Despite the pain and exhaustion, they refused to let go of the rope that kept them suspended. From the ground, the crowd erupted in applause, but Celaena could barely concentrate on anything beyond holding on to the wall and Nox. Meanwhile, high above, Kane had already reached the golden flag, raising it triumphantly as the other competitors paused to watch the scene below. Celaena gritted her teeth, feeling a mix of frustration and relief. Had she taken the easier route, she might have won, but then Nox would have fallen to his death. Though Kane's victory infuriated her, she knew there was no choice but to press on. With titanic effort, she began to climb again, helping Nox find his own way up. After the trial, Celaena found herself dining with Kale, who tried to cheer her up, pointing out that finishing 18th wasn't so bad. However, Celaena barely listened, still replaying the moments of Nox's fall and the sound of Ned Clement's body crashing to the ground. Ned's death had saved Nox from elimination, but Tumba, the assassin who had tried to cut Nox's rope, had received no punishment. Kale tried to remind her that she was following the plan by not drawing attention, though her rescue had been anything but discreet. But Celaena couldn't help feeling defeated, especially when comparing her performance to Kane's. During the conversation, Kale mentioned Arobin Hamel, the man who had trained her. Celaena briefly shared her experience with him, revealing how Arobin had trained her only to charge her for everything he'd invested in her, a debt she had finally repaid with interest. The conversation lightened when Celaena demanded an apology for Kale's harsh words during training with Nehemia. Though Kale refused to apologize, the tension dissipated in a playful exchange that left both smiling, a rarity in their relationship until then. However, the mood darkened when Philippa brought news that the champion who hadn't shown up for the trial had been found dead, brutally shredded on a servant's staircase. The murder, the second in weeks, cast a shadow over the castle, and though Celaena continued with the following stealth and tracking trials without drawing attention, the fear of becoming the next victim haunted her. As the weeks passed, Celaena improved her physical skills and contained her rage toward Kane, who continued to provoke her. Dorian, for his part, no longer visited her quarters, limiting himself to smiling at her during the trials. Though Celaena tried to focus on the tournament, the approach of the final duel unsettled her. There were 9 weeks left to determine the 4 finalists, and though she had always believed she would be one of them, she was beginning to doubt. Chapter 23. Celaena found herself in a landscape that was terrifyingly familiar. Before her stretched the sharp, gray rocks of Endovier, the same rocks she knew so well, those that crunched underfoot, that smelled of wet earth after rain, and that could cut skin at the slightest touch. The fong-shaped mountains rose toward the cloudy sky, while a cold wind whipped at her mercilessly. She wore little clothing, just dirty rags, and as she touched her stomach, she felt it churn. What had happened? How had she returned to this place? She spun on her heels, hearing the metallic clink of the shackles that bound her, and surveyed the desolation of Endovier. It was all over. She had failed and had been sent back. Pain shot through her as the crack of a whip tore through the air and struck her back. She fell to the ground, the stones ripping her knees, and the pain was so intense she thought she would die right there. But suddenly, the nightmare faded. Celaena opened her eyes, gasping for breath. Beside her, Kale watched her with concern. She was in Rifthold, in the glass castle, not in Endovier. She was drenched in sweat, and the wetness on her back uncomfortably reminded her of blood. The relief of being far from Endovier mixed with disorientation. Kale, trying to calm her, explained that it had just been a dream, but the memory of the whip and the pain still echoed in her mind. Cale informed her that it was Samhain, an important festival, and asked if she would attend the religious service. Surprised by the date, Celaena couldn't help but joke about the superstitions surrounding the festival, mocking the idea that the dead and gods were closer to the earth on that day. Despite her skepticism, she felt uneasy about celebrating the day while her mind was still trapped in Endovier's horrors. After a brief exchange, Cale left her to get ready, reminding her that she had training with Brello later. As Celaena tried to shake off the painful memory of her dream, the sound of the whip still echoed in her mind. Meanwhile, Dorian left the religious service, grateful that it was over. Although he wasn't convinced by religion, the stifling atmosphere of the temple had left him agitated. As he made his way to the gardens, he crossed paths with Celaena, dressed in a teal gown that seemed straight out of another era. Though he tried to joke about her outdated attire, Celaena took offense, and Dorian awkwardly tried to smooth things over. The conversation turned to Nehemia, who exchanged words with Dorian in Aelwi, the language of her land. Aware of the political tensions and the danger posed by Duke Parrington, Dorian avoided discussing certain topics with the princess. However, he couldn't help but feel trapped between his duties as a prince and his sympathy for Nehemia. Celaena, Nehemia, and Cale continued their walk through the garden, where they encountered Cain, the ruthless competitor in the tournament. Seeing him, Celaena felt a surge of repulsion, and Nehemia, sensing her hostility, shared her desire to punch him. After the encounter, the group approached the clock tower, where Celaena noticed strange markings on the ground that Nehemia identified as word marks, symbols of an ancient, forgotten religion. Nehemia, clearly disturbed by the marks, warned Celaena not to meddle with those ancient symbols. The conversation grew tense, and though Cale didn't fully understand what they were discussing, Celaena felt a growing unease. When Nehemia asked her to teach her the language, Celaena reluctantly agreed, knowing the princess wouldn't take no for an answer. As Nehemia walked away with a smile, Celaena couldn't help but wonder what the princess had seen in the marks and why she seemed so certain that Celaena was much more than she appeared to be. Chapter 24. Celaena lay in bed, watching a pool of moonlight spread across the floor. The silver blue light gave the room an ethereal air, almost frozen in time. Though she was used to the dark hours of the night, this time, she found no comfort in them. The night, which used to be her ally for stalking and killing, now only offered unease. It was midnight, and though she had another trial the next day, she couldn't sleep. The heaviness in her eyes made reading impossible, and she didn't want to play the pianoforte for fear of having another awkward encounter. She still wore the teal gown she'd had on all day, too lazy to change. As she followed the trail of moonlight around the room, her eyes stopped on a tapestry hanging on the wall. The tapestry depicted images of forest animals among fallen trees, and in the center, a life-sized beautiful woman with silver hair and a white dress. Suddenly, the tapestry seemed to move slightly. Celaena sat up, startled. Had it been her imagination? Determined to investigate, she lit a candle and approached the tapestry, pulling it aside to reveal a crack in the stone wall. A hidden door. She pushed the stone with her shoulder, and after some effort, the door opened, revealing a dark passageway. A mysterious breeze blew from the depths of the corridor, and a chill ran down her spine. Though she felt a brief flash of fear, curiosity won out. Preparing to explore, Celaena gathered some supplies: thread, chalk, and an improvised knife, along with several candles. She placed a chair in the doorway to keep the door from closing behind her and tied a thread to the back of it, letting it trail behind her as she ventured into the dark passage. The passage was cold and dusty, with stairs that led down into the castle's depths. The absolute silence enveloped her as she descended the steps, each one seeming to draw her deeper into a forgotten place. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she found 3 dark portals. She chose the middle one, following the incline of the stairs that continued downward. The air grew damp, and the sound of running water began to echo in the distance. As she moved forward, moonlight began to filter through the walls, indicating that she was nearing an exit. Finally, she arrived at a drain pipe that led out of the castle, where a stream flowed toward the sea or the Avery River. There were no guards in sight, and the iron gate was open. Several small boats were moored on both banks, rotting in a state of decay, suggesting they hadn't been used in a long time. Celaena contemplated the possibility of escape, but quickly dismissed the idea. She knew the king would find her, and that her flight could have serious consequences for Chaol and Nehemia. She decided to bide her time, taking advantage of the training and free meals while she planned her eventual freedom. She returned through the passageway, but before exiting the depths, she noticed another portal from which an unsettling breeze emanated. She decided not to follow the whispers that seemed to come from that direction and instead took the left passage, which led her toward the light and sound of a banquet in the Great Hall. From a bronze grill, she observed the guests, including Chaol and other champions, all enjoying the feast. Celaena felt annoyed to realize she hadn't been invited, and the sight of Dorian dancing with a blonde only fueled her irritation. She quickly returned to her quarters, ensuring everything was in place before Chaol could discover her absence. She collapsed onto the bed, exhausted but satisfied that she had uncovered a secret of the castle. Later, Dorian, having enjoyed the banquet, entered her quarters, slightly tipsy from the wine. He found Celaena asleep, still in the teal gown. Though tempted to approach closer, he lingered in the doorway, watching her silently. Just then, Chaol appeared, visibly annoyed, and pulled him out of the room, warning him that he shouldn't be there. Dorian, confused and perhaps a little hurt, left the place, not knowing why he felt so unsettled. Chaol, after ensuring that Dorian had left, returned to Celaena's quarters. Still wondering why it bothered him so much to see Dorian there, he decided not to dwell on those feelings. He approached the bed and woke Celaena, handing her a silver ring with an amethyst, a small token from the banquet. Celaena, half asleep, accepted it with a smile before sinking back into sleep. Chaol, feeling awkwardly protective, covered her with a blanket and left the room, wondering how he would explain everything to Dorian the next day. Chapter 25. Celaena found herself in another strange dream, wandering through a long, secret passage. This time, she chose a portal that seemed warm and inviting, in contrast to the other 2 that emanated cold and dampness. Guided by the sweet scent of roses, she descended a long, narrow staircase that seemed endless. At the bottom, she found herself before an ancient wooden door adorned with a bronze knocker shaped like a grinning skull. With courage, she turned the handle and entered a chamber where a beam of moonlight illuminated the figure of a woman on a stone slab. It wasn't just any statue, but a sarcophagus. The room was decorated with trees carved into the ceiling, and beside the woman lay another sarcophagus, this one with the figure of a man in darkness. Both bore crowns, but it was the woman who captured the moonlight, revealing a blue gem in her crown. Celaena examined the figures closely, noticing the word mark etched into the woman's forehead. Suddenly, the warm atmosphere turned cold, and fear gripped her as she realized she was in a forbidden place. The chamber was covered with stars engraved into the floor, with the sky and earth inverted, while the walls displayed countless word marks. Intrigued, Celaena read an inscription at the woman's feet that said, "Ah, the crack in time." Everything in this place seemed ancient and mysterious, but what surprised her most were the woman's pointed ears, indicating she was a fae. She immediately understood that she was before the tombs of Gavin, the first king of Adarlan, and Celaena, the first princess of Terrasen. When she recognized Celaena, she felt she shouldn't be there, disturbing the rest of the dead. However, her thoughts were interrupted when she discovered a treasure on the other side of the chamber, where a legendary sword caught her attention, Damaris, the sword that had killed the Dark Lord Erawan. As she admired the sword, a soft female voice startled her. Celaena turned and saw a spectral figure, Queen Celaena. Celaena explained that her spirit had risked much to appear that night. She warned Celaena of an evil lurking in the castle that needed to be destroyed before it was too late. She also insisted that Celaena win the competition and become the king's champion, for Aurelia needed someone who understood the people's suffering. Though Celaena was confused and frightened, Celaena gave her a protective amulet before pushing her out of the place quickly, as something evil was approaching. Celaena fled in terror, running through the passage until she finally found herself in her room. Still shaken by what she had experienced, she discovered that the amulet was still in her hand, confirming that it hadn't been just a dream. Afraid of what she had uncovered and the implications of Elena's words, she put the amulet around her neck, wrapped herself in her bed, and tried to find peace in sleep, though unease lingered. She knew she had to fulfill the mission Celaena had entrusted to her, though the thought of facing the evil lurking in the castle filled her with doubt and fear. Chapter 26. Celaena was startled as the doors to her bedroom flew open, causing her to immediately jump to her feet with a candlestick in hand, ready to defend herself. Cale burst into the room, his fury barely contained, clenching his teeth. Ignoring Celaena's protests, he yanked off the covers and pulled her out of bed by the elbow. With a stern expression, he interrogated her about her whereabouts the previous night. Celaena, hiding her unease, assured him she had spent the entire night in her room, reminding him that he had even visited her to give her an amethyst ring. Cale wasn't satisfied with her answer and informed her that another champion had been found dead, this time Xavier, the thief from Melisande. The gravity of the situation intensified when he mentioned that the body had been partially devoured. Despite the tension, Celaena lightly suggested it could have been Kane's doing, though she couldn't help but wonder if these murders were connected to the evil Celaena had warned her about. Cale, irritated by Celaena's nonchalant attitude, ended the conversation by telling her that training had been cancelled, prompting Celaena to curl back up in bed, feigning delight at the chance to sleep a few more hours. However, her mind was far from restful, haunted by the image of the devoured champion and the implications of what she had seen the previous night in Elena's tomb. Later, when she was alone, Celaena decided to return to the tomb to investigate, bringing several improvised weapons with her. Though she carefully explored the chamber, she found nothing new that could explain Elena's warnings or the presence of that evil. She watched as a ray of sunlight filtered through a hole in the ceiling, illuminating the place and giving it an almost ethereal look. Despite her efforts, she found no sign of the creature she had heard the night before or any trace of Elena's spirit. Confused and frustrated, she realized that if she wanted to fulfill Elena's mission, she couldn't devote all her time to investigating the source of the castle's evil without risking her success in the competition. Determined to focus on winning the tournament, she left the tomb and prepared to face the day. With her head held high and dressed in an impressive pink and white gown, Celaena walked through the castle's halls, flanked by guards. She passed several courtiers and nobles, maintaining her facade of confidence, though her mind was unsettled by recent events. Upon arriving at a crime scene, Celaena found herself staring at Xavier's mangled corpse, his chest cavity open and vital organs missing. What disturbed her most was seeing 3 word marks carved into the wall near the body, suggesting the murder was more than just an act of violence, but part of a macabre ritual. Later, Dorian practiced with Cale in the training room, trying to clear his mind of the worries that plagued him. Though he tried to joke with his friend, both were aware of the seriousness of the situation in the castle. Cale mentioned to Dorian that he had increased surveillance around Celaena, which made Dorian even more concerned for the young assassin's safety. As they discussed the matter, it became clear that both were caught in a dilemma, unsure of whom to trust or how to deal with the growing threats surrounding them. After the practice, Dorian retired to his quarters, feeling alone and overwhelmed by the uncertainty and danger lurking in every corner of the castle. Chapter 27. That night, Celaena watched the imposing clock tower, black as ebony, which seemed to absorb the last rays of the sun. The gargoyles atop remained motionless, vigilant. Elena had called them guardians, but guardians of what? Though Celaena was curious, she wasn't willing to risk investigating further, knowing the danger she might face before achieving her goal of becoming the king's champion. Suddenly, Nehemia's voice startled her from behind, asking why she was so obsessed with those creatures. Celaena tried to steer the conversation toward Nehemia's progress with the common tongue, though she couldn't take her eyes off the gargoyles. When she mentioned the word marks etched into the ground around the tower, Nehemia warned her not to try deciphering them, as they would bring her no good. As they walked away from the tower, Celaena reflected on the approaching cold winter, remembering the harsh winters in Endovier and how returning there could mean her death. Nehemia noticed the worry on Celaena's face and, to distract her, spoke of her longing to see snow for the first time. The conversation lightened as the princess invited Celaena to visit Islewy in the future, where she could experience the hot summers. However, the mood turned tense when Nehemia mentioned the brutal murder that had recently occurred in the castle. Though Celaena tried to avoid the details, Nehemia insisted, and finally, Celaena described the bloody scene where Xavier's body had been brutally mutilated, with vital organs and brain removed, leaving only a mask of terror on his face. The conversation was interrupted when Cain, accompanied by Varen, appeared under the shadow of the clock tower. Cain, with his usual arrogance, taunted Celaena, insinuating that he knew more about her than he let on. Celaena, containing her rage, tried not to rise to his provocations, knowing that any confrontation could ruin her chances in the competition and her relationships with Nehemia and Cale. With a dismissive comment, Cain bid them farewell, but Nehemia held Celaena's hand, conveying understanding and support, a gesture Celaena deeply valued, as it had been a long time since she felt someone cared for her in that way. Later, Celaena trained furiously in the weapons room, venting her anger on a practice dummy. Cale, watching from the shadows with Dorian, was impressed by the strength Celaena had regained since her time in Endovier, though he worried about her wild nature and the anger that always simmered beneath the surface. Dorian, for his part, recognized Celaena's skill but also noticed the danger she posed, especially if she lost control in a confrontation with Cain. The arrival of Nox, another competitor in the tournament, and his friendly interaction with Celaena caught Dorian's attention, who allowed them to continue training together, recognizing that having an ally in the competition could be beneficial for Celaena. Days later, Celaena was in the library, surrounded by old, dusty books, searching for answers about the mysterious word marks. Though she had found fragments of information, most were confusing and radical theories, only increasing her frustration. Cale, who accompanied her, tried to ease the tension with jokes, though he noticed that Celaena was more worried than she let on. While Celaena explored a particularly dark volume titled The Living Dead, she came across a disturbing illustration of a decayed creature that seemed to stare at her from the pages. As the atmosphere around her grew colder, she began to feel an unsettling presence in the library, as if something dark was lurking in the shadows. When a strange noise echoed from below her feet, Celaena was alarmed, but Cale, with a mischievous grin, revealed that it was just him playing a prank. Despite the joke, the sense of danger didn't disappear, and Celaena decided it was best to leave that book behind, leaving the library with her mind still filled with unanswered questions about the word marks and the mysteries surrounding the castle. Chapter 28. Celaena, frustrated and determined, was unsuccessfully trying to play billiards in the game room. After repeatedly failing to hit the ball, her patience was quickly running out. She needed a break after long hours of training and intense research on the word marks, but it seemed even a simple game was challenging her. As time passed and midnight approached, Celaena swore she would master billiards or destroy the table in the attempt. When she finally managed to sink a ball into the pocket, her victory was overshadowed by her frustration at seeing the ball stop at the edge of the hole. In a fit of rage, she yelled at the ball and, without holding back, bit the cue stick. At that moment, Dorian appeared in the doorway, surprising her with a sarcastic comment about her skill at the game. Celaena, visibly embarrassed, tried to defend herself with sharp words, but Dorian, with a smile, offered to help teach her how to play. Though Celaena tried to maintain her pride, she eventually allowed the prince to approach and show her how to hold the cue stick correctly. Both blushed at the contact, but Dorian, trying to maintain composure, calmly explained the movements. Under his guidance, Celaena managed to sink a ball into the pocket, giving them an excuse to keep playing. As the night wore on, the game turned into a friendly competition. Despite losing every match, Celaena had more fun than she expected, eating desserts that Dorian had ordered, laughing and discussing books, history, and theater. The conversation flowed naturally, as if they had known each other forever. Dorian, charmed by Celaena's intelligence and wit, promised to take her to a play after the competition was over. Though the promise created a brief awkward silence, they soon resumed their conversation, enjoying each other's company. Finally, fatigue began to overtake Celaena, who fell asleep in the armchair by the fire. Dorian, watching her with tenderness, realized how much he wanted to learn more about her past, about how she became an assassin, and how she learned to play the pianoforte. Curiosity and a desire to understand her better filled him, but he knew it wasn't the time to ask questions. Gently, Dorian woke Celaena and guided her to her bedroom. Despite her sleepiness, she mumbled about the books by her bed, and Dorian, seeing that she was deeply asleep, extinguished the candles in the room. Before leaving, he noticed a curious pendant that glowed on her neck, feeling that it seemed familiar, though he couldn't remember where he had seen it before. Without making a sound, he took the books she had mentioned and silently said goodbye, for the first time softly pronouncing her name. As he returned to his quarters, Dorian wondered if Celaena would change once she became the king's champion and regained her freedom. Was all this a facade to achieve her goals, or was the assassin he had come to know genuine? He wanted to believe that the real Celaena was the one who had shared laughter and conversations with him that night, but uncertainty accompanied him on his way back, leaving a question hanging in the air that only time could answer. Chapter 29. The third trial of the tournament arrived, and Celaena watched, arms crossed, as Cain fought Tumba in the training room. She knew that Cain knew her true identity, which made all her precautions and secrets nothing more than entertainment for him. As the two combatants clashed in the ring, Celaena gritted her teeth, feeling a mix of frustration and tension. The duel was simple. Whoever won would secure their place in the competition, while the loser would be at the mercy of Brello's judgment, who would decide whether they should leave. Cain, with his strength and skill, dominated the fight, barely showing signs of fatigue as he pushed Tumba toward the edge of defeat. The atmosphere in the room grew increasingly tense as Cain, with an arrogant smile, cornered Tumba and brought his sword to the assassin's throat. The victory was undisputed, and Brello applauded him. Meanwhile, Varen, with his curly hair, wasted no time provoking Celaena with vulgar comments, insinuating that Nox was protecting her in exchange for favors. Varen's provocation ignited Celaena's fury, and she confronted him with sharp words, challenging him to a fight. The situation quickly escalated, and Brello intervened, ordering them to settle their differences in the ring. Without hesitation, Celaena stepped into the ring, ready to show Varen that she was not someone to be trifled with. The fight was quick and decisive. With precise and furious movements, Celaena disarmed Varen, striking him so hard that he flew out of the ring. The room fell silent, surprised by the speed and brutality of her victory. With a cold threat, she warned Varen that next time, she would do it with a sword. Without waiting for a response, she approached Brello, demanding to be pitted against real men if they wanted her to try her best. As she walked away, she passed Kane and challenged him with a venomous smile, making it clear that her goal was to win the competition. Back in her quarters, Celaena gazed out at the snow softly falling from the mountains toward Rifthold, heralding the arrival of a storm. The strange brightness of the sky gave the world an unreal appearance, as if she were trapped in a snow globe. Moving away from the window, she stopped in front of the tapestry of Queen Elena, thinking about how different the adventure she had dreamed of as a child was from the harsh reality in which she was immersed. She felt alone in her fight for freedom, wishing that Sam were there to support her, as he had in the past. As she reflected, her hand rested on the amulet she wore around her neck, finding some small comfort in it. The stag in the tapestry, a symbol of Terrasen, reminded her of her roots, a connection she shared with Elena, who, despite being Queen of Adarlan, never stopped belonging to Terrasen. However, as the wind howled outside, Celaena realized that the real evil in the castle was not an arcane mystery, but the man who ruled it. Elsewhere in the castle, Celaena Rompier attended a dull acrobatics show, an event organized by Queen Georgina. Although Celaena was physically present, her mind was occupied with other thoughts. She knew Parrington desired her, and with the right pressure, she could turn that desire into her becoming a duchess. But her ambition didn't stop there. Her true goal was Prince Dorian. The previous week, she had suffered intense headaches, pounding with the insistence that what she had was not enough. Conversing with the Queen, Celaena feigned interest in the show and suggested that Dorian would have enjoyed it as well, though she knew that wasn't true. The Queen, puzzled, revealed that Dorian had mentioned a young woman he was interested in but didn't know her identity. Celaena, frustrated and with her head throbbing, hid her disappointment behind a smile, while the Queen praised her for her intelligence and beauty. As the music began to play, Celaena realized that her moment had arrived. Parrington had provided the tools, and now she was ready to use them to achieve her true goal. Chapter 30. Celaena was practicing archery under Cale's supervision in an abandoned corridor of the castle. Though she tried to focus, her mind was scattered, and Cale didn't hesitate to point it out. Celaena, irritated, insisted that she was focused, but her shot missed by several centimeters. Cale challenged her to try again, and though she did, the shot once again went wide. The tension between them was palpable, accentuated by Cale's slight dark circles, who seemed as tired as Celaena after weeks without resolving the murders that had shaken the castle. As they argued, Celaena revealed that Kane knew who she was and that Parrington had told him. Though Cale tried to reassure her, assuring her that their trust in her hadn't been lost, it was clear that the situation had changed. Their conversation was interrupted when two guards came running with news of another corpse. Celaena, always ready to prove her skill, agreed to accompany Cale to the crime scene, though she couldn't help but notice that her arrow had missed the target. Upon arriving at the murder scene, what they found was horrifying. Varen's corpse, one of the competitors, was mutilated, with his chest cavity open and his face disfigured. But the most disturbing part was the word marks drawn on either side of the body and the deep claw marks on the floor. Celaena, analyzing the scene, deduced that the creature that had attacked Varen had done so methodically and calculatedly, sharpening its claws before the attack and possibly incapacitating Varen so he couldn't escape. As they discussed the implications of what they had found, Celaena reached a terrifying conclusion. The champion killer and the evil force Celaena had warned her about might be the same entity. This revelation made both her and Cale realize the gravity of the situation. Later, back in her quarters, Celaena was absorbed in a book, searching for some clue about the word marks and what they might mean. The research wasn't giving her clear answers, and frustration mixed with exhaustion. As she pored over a map of Aurelia, her mind wandered to Orinth, the capital of Terrasen, her lost home. The weight of her situation and the strange dreams that haunted her made her feel more isolated and vulnerable. In the midst of her thoughts, Dorian appeared in her room, tired and disheveled. Though Celaena tried to appear indifferent, she couldn't help but feel relieved by his presence, knowing that the killer only seemed to attack when the champions were alone. Their conversation ranged from serious to light topics, revealing more of their personalities and their growing attraction to each other. Dorian tried to learn more about Celaena's past, but she kept her secrets well guarded, allowing him only a glimpse of her love for music, a passion that reminded her of her old dream of becoming a healer. As they talked, Dorian made a confession about his reluctance to marry someone who wasn't his equal in mind and spirit. Celaena, practical and down-to-earth, criticized him for his idealism, but despite their differences, the conversation flowed naturally, bringing them even closer. However, when Dorian tried to learn more about the ring Celaena wore, she evaded the question, knowing that revealing its origin could complicate things. At the end of the conversation, Dorian suggested they play billiards, and though Celaena tried to keep her distance, she couldn't deny that she liked being near him, a realization that left her uneasy. Elsewhere in the castle, Cale observed Parrington during a dinner in the dining hall. As the night wore on, he noticed something strange about the Duke's behavior, as if a shadow darkened his face at certain moments, only to quickly disappear. Cale, who had always been suspicious of Parrington, wondered if there was more to him than met the eye, especially as he noticed that Kaltain was also watching the Duke with a strange intensity. Though Cale couldn't find any concrete reason to suspect Parrington beyond his ambition, he couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was going on, a feeling that stayed with him as he returned to his quarters, with the unsettling thought that the Duke might also be watching him. Chapter 31. Celaena was lying in her bed when she felt a presence in her room. Without opening her eyes, she pulled an improvised knife from under her pillow, but a female voice stopped her. Before her stood Elena, the first queen of Adarlan, who, though solid, glowed with an ethereal light. The queen, with her long silver hair and a serene smile, reminded Celaena that she must win the competition, though the assassin made it clear that she was doing it only to regain her freedom, not to obey a ghost. Elena, with a sigh, acknowledged that Celaena did not trust her and, although she claimed to know little about the evil lurking among the champions, she warned her to pay attention to her right. Without further explanation, the queen vanished, leaving Celaena restless and confused. The next day, during a new trial, Celaena and the other champions were tasked with identifying and ranking poisons in cups. The real test was to drink from the cup they deemed least dangerous. As she analyzed the poisons, Celaena remembered Elena's words. She observed Pelaer, the young assassin to her right, who placed a cup of water as the deadliest and a cup of wine as the least harmful. Realizing Elena's signal, Celaena replicated Pelaer's decision, trusting his knowledge. In the end, Celaena and Pelaer passed the test without needing antidotes, unlike other champions who suffered the effects of the poisons. Although Celaena had cheated by relying on Pelaer's help, she considered the shared victory a small alliance. However, Elena's warning weighed on her mind. Despite the Queen's protection, Celaena had no intention of becoming the King's champion just to fulfill the plans of a ghost. Chapter 32. Celaena and Nehemia, accompanied by a group of guards, decided to cut their lesson short and walk through the castle's vast hallways. Although guards always followed Celaena, Nehemia never commented on it. Despite the fact that Maas was a month away and the final duel would be 5 days later, the two friends continued to dedicate an hour each day before dinner to practicing languages. Celaena helped Nehemia improve her writing in the common tongue, while both preferred to speak in Aelwi, the princess's native language, which allowed them to keep their conversations private. Nehemia noticed Celaena's worry, who tried to downplay it by mentioning that she had spent the night reading, though in reality, she had barely slept due to another champion's death and Elena's unsettling orders. Nehemia, perceptive and concerned for her friend, offered her support and friendship, which deeply moved Celaena, who hadn't felt so close to someone in a long time. During their walk, Nehemia mentioned that she had to attend a play that night at Queen Georgina's invitation and asked Celaena to accompany her as a translator. However, Celaena declined, which irritated Nehemia, who speculated about the reasons behind Captain Kale's constant surveillance of Celaena, suggesting that they saw her as a threat. As they walked, they arrived at the castle kennels. Nehemia, excited to see the puppies that Dorian had shown her the day before, led Celaena inside. There they found the crown prince, who was playing with several puppies. Among them was one in particular, with gold and silver fur, that kept to itself and did not interact with the others, which concerned Nehemia. Dorian explained that if the puppy's behavior did not improve, it would be put down. Horrified by the idea of killing the puppy just for being reserved, Celaena offered to take care of it to save it, to which Dorian agreed, promising that no harm would come to it. The closeness between Celaena and Dorian at that moment did not go unnoticed by Nehemia, who later hinted that there might be something more between them. Celaena, however, denied any interest, emphasizing that she only enjoyed provoking the prince. As they walked back, they ran into Cain, who suddenly appeared behind Celaena. The huge warrior, with an expression of suffering and anguish, seemed to be struggling against something invisible. Celaena noticed that his musculature had increased abnormally in recent days, and when she tried to speak to him, Cain ran off, terrified by something she couldn't see. Intrigued and alarmed, Celaena quickly returned to her quarters and sent messages to Nox and Pelaer, warning them to stay safe in their rooms and not open the door to anyone that night. Chapter 33. Celaena nervously prepared herself in her dressing room, pinching her cheeks and applying perfume to mask the smell of opium. She had been smoking when Duke Parrington's arrival was announced, so she hurriedly changed her clothes to avoid arousing the Duke's suspicion. Entering the parlor, Celaena felt the Duke's gaze fixed on her, a man who always seemed ready for battle. Though she tried to maintain her composure, the opium in her system made her see the world in a distorted way, as if she were trapped in a charming yet suffocating cage. The Duke inquired about her well-being, mentioning that he had not seen her at dinner. Celaena, feeling weak and dizzy, tried to justify her absence by claiming she felt unwell. As the Duke spoke, Celaena's mind wandered, perceiving the Duke as a marble figure, rigid and inhuman. Despite her discomfort, Celaena attempted to manipulate the conversation for her own ends. When Parrington mentioned Lady Lillian, Celaena's rage and envy intensified. She subtly insinuated that Lillian was unworthy of Prince Dorian due to her dark past, hoping the Duke would take steps to eliminate her rival. Meanwhile, Celaena was engrossed in reading an old book about word marks when the door to her room burst open, interrupting her concentration. To her surprise, it was not Dorian who entered but Nehemia, dressed in a beautiful gown embroidered in gold. The princess, with tear-filled eyes and a downcast face, seemed to be in a state of deep distress. Nehemia, with a trembling voice, revealed to Celaena that she had just received a letter with devastating news. 500 rebels from Islwey, including children, had been massacred by the Adarlan army. The soldiers had captured the rebels in the oak-walled forests and, after an escape attempt, had killed them as punishment. The princess, overwhelmed by helplessness and pain, wondered what good it was to be the princess of Islwey if she couldn't protect her people. Celaena, moved by Nehemia's suffering, tried to comfort her as best she could. The princess, unable to contain her tears any longer, threw herself into Celaena's arms, who held her as Nehemia wept uncontrollably, trying to alleviate the immense pain she felt. Chapter 34. Celaena watched the dance of the snowflakes in the dark from her window. Nehemia had returned to her quarters, her head held high and her tears dry, but Celaena remained alone, struggling with the pain in her abdomen that had tormented her for over an hour. She wrapped herself in blankets, seeking warmth, when Philippa entered with a cup of tea, comforting her with her presence and words about the tragedy of the Islwey rebels. Celaena appreciated the gesture, though the pain did not subside, and the warmth from the fireplace did not reach her. After Philippa left, Cale appeared in her room, concerned about Nehemia and unaware of Celaena's discomfort. When he finally realized that Celaena was truly unwell, she tried to explain between cramps and nausea, but before she could say more, she vomited on the floor. Cale, horrified but concerned, helped her to bed, not fully understanding the situation until Celaena, embarrassed, explained that it was her menstrual cramps, newly returned after months of amenorrhea due to malnutrition in Endovier. Cale, embarrassed, quickly withdrew, stumbling in his haste to leave. Shortly after, Dorian appeared in the room, amused by Cale's discomfort and ready to distract Celaena with a card game. Despite her pain, Celaena joked with him, rejecting his offer and throwing a book at him when he insisted on staying. Dorian caught it, surprised to discover it was a romance novel. Despite his attempts to read a scandalous passage, Celaena teased him, enjoying the verbal game. The conversation between them took a more serious tone when Dorian, with sincerity, confessed his shame for the atrocities committed by his father and the Adarlan army. He lamented his own powerlessness to stop the injustices and expressed his regret for being part of such a cruel system. Celaena, moved, assured him that she did not hate him and did not see him as she did the others at court. Before leaving, Dorian, in a spontaneous gesture, kissed Celaena on the cheek. She tensed, but did not reject the gesture. As he left, both were left with mixed feelings, Dorian, confused by the sadness he perceived in her, and Celaena, thoughtful and aware of the gravity of the problems surrounding them, from the massacres in Islwey to the mysterious evil lurking in the castle's corridors. Chapter 35. Cale Westfall watched from the castle's second floor as two figures walked slowly among the garden hedges. One of them, easily recognizable by her white cape, was Celaena. The other, marked by his characteristic aura, was Dorian. Cale knew he should be downstairs, closely monitoring them, making sure Celaena didn't seize the opportunity to use Dorian as a means of escape. However, he couldn't move. Each passing day, he felt the barriers he had erected against her melting away. This wasn't just because of her genuine laughter, but also because he had seen her asleep with her face between the pages of a book, and because he knew she was going to win. Despite being a criminal, a ruthless and cunning assassin, Celaena was also a young woman who had been sent to Endovier at 17 and had survived despite the harsh conditions. Cale couldn't help but compare his life to Celaena's at that age, when he was training with the guards, living in comfort, and having friends. Celaena had endured cold, hunger, and had seen death up close, yet she could still laugh. What terrified him most was not seeing her so close to Dorian, but that he trusted her. As she walked with Dorian through the gardens, Celaena couldn't help but smile. She had accepted his invitation to take a walk after dinner. Though it was so cold, she wished she could absorb Dorian's warmth. Nehemia, after learning about the rebels' massacre, had preferred to stay in her quarters, leaving Celaena alone to face the cold. Although more than 3 weeks had passed since her last encounter with Elena, Celaena had not seen or heard anything more from the Queen. During that time, she had passed several tests, including an obstacle course, but had also witnessed the deaths of 3 competitors, whose mutilated bodies were found in forgotten hallways. The situation had reduced the number of participants to only 6: Kane, Grave, Knox, a soldier, and Renault, a ruthless mercenary. As they passed by a fountain, Dorian asked Celaena about the pendant she always wore. Though she tried to downplay it, Dorian recognized a resemblance in the pendant to the legendary Eye of Elena, a magical amulet of great power said to be lost. Celaena, though she tried to laugh off the comment, couldn't help but feel uneasy, knowing that Dorian was right. Later, back in her room, Celaena tried to focus on a book, but her mind kept spinning around the unanswered questions about Elena and the pendant. A noise in her room startled her, and as she got up to pick up the book she had dropped, she discovered word marks drawn in chalk under the bed. Horrified, she quickly tried to erase them with water, but the feeling of imminent danger did not fade. Without wasting time, Celaena headed to the library in search of answers. However, upon arrival, she found Nehemia, who was reading an ancient book, something that didn't match her supposed level of knowledge of the common tongue. Nehemia quickly closed the book and hid it, responding to Celaena with a tone that was not her usual. Something was not right. As Celaena left the library, a crumpled piece of paper fell to the floor, showing a word mark similar to the one she had seen before. Celaena froze as she realized that Nehemia might be involved in something darker than she had imagined. Although the princess was her friend, the evidence suggested she might be deceiving her, and the possibility that Nehemia was conspiring against them began to fill her mind with doubts and fear. Chapter 36. For several days, Celaena avoided seeing Nehemia, not mentioning the unsettling discovery of the word marks under her bed to anyone. She knew she couldn't confront the princess without concrete evidence, so she spent her free time feverishly researching those mysterious marks, desperate to find answers that would connect them to the murders and the beast lurking in the castle. Despite her concerns, she underwent another test without incident, eliminating 1 more soldier and leaving only 5 competitors remaining. The final duel was rapidly approaching, with only 3 days left. On the morning of Maas, Celaena awoke to an unusually tranquil atmosphere. Snow was falling gently, covering the castle in a blanket of silence. Determined to enjoy the day, she promised herself not to think about Nehemia, the duel, or the ball she would not be allowed to attend. However, when she turned over in bed, she found a large paper bag filled with treats. Without a label or name, Celaena shrugged and began to enjoy the sweets, letting the joy of Maas fill her heart. Filippo appeared in the doorway, surprised by the sugary mess and candies covering the bed. Celaena, with her teeth stained red from the treats, couldn't help but laugh at the situation, despite Filippo's scoldings. After a moment of shared laughter, the maid helped her dress for the ceremony at the temple, choosing a solemn green dress. Celaena felt happy, grateful for Filippo's kindness, and determined to enjoy the day. As she left her room, Celaena encountered Dorian, who was waiting for her with a basket at his feet. Though the bag of sweets had been his, Dorian brought another gift, a golden puppy, the same one she had met in the kennels. Initially shy and scared, the dog relaxed next to Celaena, quickly winning her affection. Dorian, nervous about how his gift would be received, was relieved when Celaena accepted the puppy and thanked him with a kiss on the cheek, a gesture that left him stammering and embarrassed. As Dorian left, nervous about her reaction, Celaena began to think about Nehemia. The idea that the princess could be involved in the murders deeply troubled her, and she wondered if Nehemia might use the Yilmaz ball to unleash disaster. Although Celaena knew her fears might be irrational, the possibility that something terrible could happen led her to make an impulsive decision to attend the ball that night, no matter the consequences. Later, during her walk to the temple with Cale, Celaena tried to joke with him, but she couldn't help but notice that the captain never seemed to relax in her presence, unlike Dorian. Cale mentioned the ball, hinting that he didn't fully trust her. Despite her efforts to appear carefree, Celaena couldn't help but feel hurt by Cale's distrust. Although she knew her plan to sneak into the ball would anger him, she was willing to take the risk because the mere thought of someone she cared about getting hurt made her willing to defy any order. Chapter 37. Sitting on a bench at the back of the spacious glass temple, Celaena clenched her mouth so tightly it hurt, worried about her teeth being stained red from the candies. The temple, built entirely of glass, was an imposing and beautiful place. Light filtered through the snow accumulated on the glass vault, creating whimsical shapes that illuminated the interior with an ethereal glow. The glass walls and stained glass windows floated above the altar, giving the space a sense of lightness. From her seat, Celaena stood to observe the congregation. Dorian and the Queen occupied the front bench, escorted by guards, while Duke Parrington and Kaltain were on the other side of the aisle. Nehemia was also present, sitting behind the Duke. Celaena sat back down, frustrated at not being able to attend the ball that night, even though she was allowed to be at the ceremony. Cale, sitting beside her, scolded her to stay still. The High Priestess, in her dark blue robe with an 8-pointed star tattooed on her forehead, began the ceremony by speaking of the goddess and her firstborn, Loomis. But Celaena found it hard to concentrate. The combination of fatigue and disinterest led her to drift into sleep. A while later, Cale abruptly woke her as the nearby nobles chuckled softly. The ceremony had progressed to the procession of the gods, a tradition in which 9 children, dressed as gods, walked down the aisle blindfolded, bestowing blessings on the chosen ones. Celaena, trying to hide her discomfort, watched as the children passed through the crowd. When Diana, the goddess of the hunt and maidens, approached her, Celaena felt a sudden unease. The girl stopped in front of her, removed her blindfold, and blessed her, handing her a golden arrow as a symbol of protection. Celaena, surprised and nervous under everyone's gaze, took the arrow with some discomfort. Cale, in an unusual gesture, returned the arrow to her when she tried to give it to him, suggesting she shouldn't tempt the gods. Something in his tone and expression made Celaena wonder what was going on in the captain's mind, who seemed more serious and concerned than usual. Chapter 38. Meters of silk and flashes of pearls and diamonds surrounded Celaena as Philippa finished placing the last curl in her hair. The young assassin felt like a true princess as she looked at herself in the mirror. With a mask covering her face and a crystal tiara on her head, the reflection she saw dazzled her. Philippa, kneeling before her, polished the crystal details of her silver shoes, comparing her to the Queen of the Fae, though she avoided mentioning the word forbidden by the King of Adarlan. The dress she wore was the most beautiful she had ever worn in her life, with gray tones and gemstone embellishments reminiscent of the sea's surface. The silk formed roses on the skirt, while a lace ruffle adorned the neckline, gently covering her shoulders. Small drop-shaped diamonds adorned her ears, and her hair, styled in a high updo with beads, made her look like an ethereal figure. Philippa, concerned, reminded her that Cale would not be happy with her decision to attend the ball, to which Celaena responded with a stern look, asking her not to ask questions. The maid resigned herself, fearing the consequences, but helped Celaena out of the room, making up an excuse to the guards about an invitation from the prince. Res, one of the guards, offered her his arm and escorted her to the entrance of the ballroom, where the large red and gold glass doors marked the beginning of the party. The sound of waltz music filled the air as Celaena approached the entrance, her heart racing. She knew she shouldn't forget the real reason for her presence, to watch over Nehemia and ensure she didn't cause any harm. The improvised dagger hidden in her bodice reminded her of her mission. When she arrived at the ballroom, Celaena's appearance left everyone breathless. Her dress sparkled as if it were made of stars, and her entrance caused such an impact that even the queen and Nehemia stood up to watch her. Dorian, from his position, was paralyzed at the sight of her, recognizing the assassin's silhouette despite the mask. Cale, for his part, was the first to approach her. Though he tried to hide his fury, Celaena noticed his annoyance. He led her to a corner of the ballroom, reprimanding her for her recklessness, but Celaena defended herself, saying she just wanted to have fun. In the end, Cale relented, warning her not to do anything that would make him regret letting her stay. Celaena positioned herself in a strategic spot from where she could observe everything, including Nehemia, who was sitting next to the queen. Despite her vigilance, an hour later, Celaena began to question her decision to attend. Nehemia seemed calm, engrossed in conversation. When the princess stood up to leave, Celaena felt a mix of relief and shame, realizing that she might have misjudged her friend. Cale, always by her side, noticed her confusion and asked what was going on, but Celaena merely evaded the question. She decided to change the subject and, in an attempt to distract herself, asked him to take her out to dance. Cale, though initially refusing, began to speak with her in a more personal manner. Celaena confessed that she found him handsome, and for a moment, the air between them seemed to change, charged with an unexpected tension. However, Dorian interrupted their conversation, inviting Celaena to dance. Although Cale tried to dissuade them, Dorian insisted, and finally, the young assassin accepted. As she approached the prince, she felt the world fade away around her, reduced to the intensity of Dorian's gaze, who complimented her and made her feel desired. Despite everything, she never lost sight of the crowd, always remembering her mission. Chapter 39. Dorian was lost in a dreamlike world as he danced with Celaena. He felt her warm body and her soft fingers intertwined with his as he spun her around the floor. They danced with perfect fluidity, oblivious to the jealous glances of the other women who watched as, one after another, the musical pieces ended and began again without the two changing partners. Although it was frowned upon for a prince to dedicate all his dances to a single lady, Dorian could think of nothing but Celaena and the music that enveloped them. Celaena remarked, almost with amusement, about Dorian's boundless energy, and he, with a smile, joked about how dance lessons had been his punishment as a child. However, beneath the surface of their light conversation, both seemed to seek something deeper in those shared moments. Dorian took her by the waist, feeling the urge to kiss her, but he restrained himself, aware of the reality that separated them. He was a prince, and she was an assassin. Meanwhile, Cale watched the scene from a distance, irritated by the closeness between his friend and Celaena. Although he couldn't allow himself to take her out to dance, he felt a pang of jealousy, seeing the connection between them. Otho, a courtier known for his bad reputation, approached Cale and began to interrogate him about the identity of the mysterious lady, but Cale remained discreet, though his discomfort grew as he listened to Otho insinuate that the prince was in love with Celaena. Chaol watched as Dorian and Celaena moved together, and although he knew he couldn't intervene, he couldn't help but feel that his friend was crossing a dangerous line. As the dance continued, Chaol decided he could no longer watch his friend so captivated and left the ball, overwhelmed by his own confused feelings. In another corner of the ballroom, Celaena watched the scene with rage and desperation. She recognized Celaena despite the mask and couldn't stand to see her monopolizing Dorian's attention. Trapped in her own frustration and Parrington's pressure, Celaena decided she had to do something to eliminate Lillian, no matter the cost. When the clock struck 3, Celaena decided it was time to leave. Taking advantage of Dorian going for drinks, she slipped out of the ballroom, accompanied by Ress, who escorted her back to her quarters. Although the reasons that led her to the ball were not the best, Celaena couldn't help but smile as she recalled the attention she had received from Dorian. However, upon arriving in her room, she found Dorian waiting for her. The prince had followed her to her room, closing the door behind them. With a playful smile, Dorian approached her, reproaching her for leaving without saying goodbye. Being so close to him, Celaena felt a whirlwind of emotions, and when he kissed her, she fully gave in to the moment. The intensity of their kisses left her breathless, but when thoughts of Endovier crept into her mind, Celaena pulled away, stopping Dorian before things went further. Dorian, still full of charm, tried to kiss her again, but Celaena made an excuse, saying she needed to sleep. Though the prince tried to persuade her, she held her ground. Finally, Dorian kissed her one last time before leaving her with her heart pounding. After Dorian left, Celaena stepped out onto the balcony, letting the cool air calm her. Alone with her thoughts, she touched her lips, trying to understand what had just happened. For his part, Dorian walked back to his quarters, his heart racing and determined to make his relationship with Celaena work, no matter the consequences. Meanwhile, in the garden, Chaol watched from a distance at Celaena's balcony, seeing her dance alone under the stars. He knew his thoughts did not belong to him, but he couldn't take his eyes off her until she finally retreated inside, leaving him alone with his own conflicting feelings. Chapter 40. Celaena awoke to the cold, wet sensation of her puppy's nose on her cheek. The sun was shining into the room, and she, still sleepy, realized she had slept much longer than planned. With the final test approaching, it was crucial that she prepared, for this last trial would determine who would be the finalists in the competition. As she stretched, Dorian appeared in the room and informed her that it was almost 1 in the afternoon. Celaena, surprised by how late it was, felt a mix of relief and guilt. Despite the tranquility of the night, the shadow of her distrust towards Nehemia still weighed on her. Dorian asked if she had decided on a name for the puppy yet. After a brief exchange of ideas, she chose to name her Lightfoot, a name that seemed to have been waiting to be discovered. The atmosphere between them was tense, still marked by the kiss they had shared the previous night. As they discussed what had happened, Celaena tried to downplay the importance of the kiss, though she couldn't help but feel a great discomfort. Dorian, on the other hand, was more playful, though his tone became serious when he noticed the scars on Celaena's back, a sign of the painful experiences she had endured. With dignity, she reminded him that everyone carried scars, though hers were more visible. Meanwhile, Celaena strolled alongside Duke Parrington in the castle's greenhouse, surrounded by plants that she found as indifferent as they were annoying. The Duke, sensing her discouragement, confronted her with his observations. He mentioned that he had noticed her interest in Prince Dorian and then revealed the true identity of Lilian Gordina, none other than Celaena Sardothien, the famous assassin. This left Celaena perplexed and worried, for the assassin had not only gained the prince's trust but also stood in the way of her ambitions to become queen. Harrington, with cunning, suggested a solution to eliminate Celaena without Dorian suspecting. He proposed that Celaena participate in a plan during the champion's final duel, in which she would administer Celaena a dose of bloodbane, enough to weaken her but not kill her. Though Celaena hesitated at the idea of directly murdering someone, the prospect of winning the prince's favor led her to accept the plan. With her mind fixed on her ambition to reach the throne, Celaena was willing to do whatever it took to eliminate her rival. Chapter 41. When the clock struck 10, Celaena, sitting at her small desk, realized she should have been asleep by now. Lightfoot, the small puppy she had adopted, rested on her lap as she examined an old book. The word marks, with their intricate angles and curves, stared back at her from the pages, challenging her to understand a language still unknown to her. Celaena couldn't help but wonder how long it had taken Nehemia to learn these symbols and how they could still retain their power in a world where magic had vanished. Uncertainty and guilt consumed her, especially after suspecting her friend. Although she knew Nehemia had reasons to hide her mastery of the common tongue, Celaena couldn't stop regretting her distrust. As she turned the pages, she suddenly froze upon finding the same symbols she had seen near the corpses of the murdered champions. What she read next left her breathless: a ritual to summon a creature called a Ridderak, using human sacrifices to gain the strength of the victims. Terror gripped her as she realized someone was using the word marks to summon this creature. Although magic had disappeared, the texts claimed that the word marks existed independently of magic, meaning they could still be powerful. But the idea that Nehemia could be involved in something so dark was impossible for her to accept. However, doubts began to grow. What if Nehemia had a hidden agenda? What if she was involved in a rebellion much larger than Celaena had imagined? The thought that Nehemia might be behind the murders deeply disturbed her. It made no sense to kill the champions instead of the royalty, and there were no signs of demons in the princess's quarters. But when she noticed the tapestry behind the dresser fluttering slightly, as if moved by a ghostly breeze, her heart stopped. All the murders had occurred after one of the tests, meaning the Ridderak could attack that very night. With a mix of fear and determination, Celaena decided to investigate. After leaving Lightfoot outside the room, she covered the secret door with the tapestry and ventured into the dark tunnels beneath the castle, armed only with a candelabrum and an improvised dagger. If Nehemia had truly lied and was behind the deaths, Celaena knew she had to be prepared for the worst. As she descended, the air grew colder and denser, and whispers began to echo in the distance. She cautiously approached the source of the sounds, hearing a guttural, raspy voice reciting words in an unknown language. Finally, she reached a chamber illuminated by a greenish light, and looking inside, she saw a figure kneeling in the darkness. Cain, one of the champions. Cain's presence in that place, performing what appeared to be a ritual, confirmed Celaena's worst fears. The danger was closer than she had imagined. Chapter 42. Cain, the competitor who had displayed surprising strength and skill throughout the tournament, was using the word marks to steal the strength of the dead champions. In the darkness of the underground chamber, Celaena watched as he drew symbols on the ground with his own blood, summoning a fearsome monster, the Ridderak. This creature, with its grayish skin, deformed head, and black fangs, looked like a nightmare born from an ancient god, a being that had devoured Varen and Xavier. The Ridderak, with its hind legs resembling those of an animal, approached Cain and knelt in submission. Terrified, Celaena tried to retreat, but Cain discovered her. The wind pushed her into the chamber, and before she could react, Cain moved with inhuman speed, snatching her knife and closing the door behind him, trapping her with the creature. The Ridderak, its eyes filled with insatiable hunger, stalked Celaena, who was desperate to find an escape. She knew Cain had done this on purpose, so the creature could immobilize her and devour her slowly, just as it had done with the other champions. But Celaena was not willing to give up without a fight. Remembering Elena's tomb, she realized she needed to reach the sepulchre where Gavin's sword, Damaris, was located. In a desperate and brave move, Celaena dropped her cloak and ran toward the Ritterak, managing to dodge it just as the creature lunged at her. The monster smashed through the chamber door as it crashed into it, giving Celaena a chance to escape. She sprinted through the dark tunnels toward the burial chamber, hoping to find the sword that could save her. Upon reaching the tomb, she found Damaris, glowing under the moonlight. At the last moment, just as the Ritterak reached her, Celaena turned and plunged the sword into the creature's face. The battle was brutal, and although she managed to kill the Ritterak, she was gravely injured, with her right hand trapped between the monster's fangs. With the creature finally dead and the sword bloodied in her hands, Celaena collapsed, exhausted and in pain. Still in shock, she approached Celaena's sarcophagus and, in a gesture of gratitude, murmured a few words before dragging herself back to her room. Once in her quarters, her weakened body could take no more, and she fell to the floor, unconscious from blood loss and exhaustion. Just before darkness enveloped her, she heard Nehemia's voice, who found her and quickly took her to the baths. Nehemia, chanting words in an ancient language, submerged her in water and, using the word marks, tried to heal her. The turquoise marks glowed on Celaena's skin as the darkness finally consumed her. Chapter 43. Celaena woke up in a warm and cozy environment, surrounded by the soft golden light of candles and the delicate scent of lotus flowers mixed with nutmeg. Despite the apparent serenity of the place, confusion enveloped her as she couldn't remember how she had arrived there. Upon inspecting her hand, she was astonished to discover that the wounds she had suffered were completely healed, leaving only a crescent-shaped scar and small marks where the Ritterak's teeth had left their imprint. This miracle seemed impossible, as if someone had healed her through inexplicable power. Sitting near her bed, Nehemia watched her with a somber expression, while faithful Lightfoot rested at Celaena's feet. The Princess of Alwi wasted no time in questioning Celaena, wanting to know what had happened to cause such severe injuries. Despite the confusion, Nehemia had managed to save her in time, but now she demanded answers. Still processing what had happened, Celaena decided to reveal her true identity, confessing that she was not who she claimed to be. To Nehemia's surprise, the assassin admitted that her real name was Celaena Sardothien, a revelation that shook the princess, who soon realized that Celaena had survived the hell of Endovier. The distrust that had tainted their friendship dissipated as Nehemia, with tears in her eyes, realized all the suffering Celaena had endured in silence. The conversation turned more intimate when Nehemia bestowed a new name upon Celaena, Elentia, meaning unbreakable spirit. This gesture of deep friendship left Celaena deeply moved, feeling that, despite everything, she had found an unshakable bond in the princess. The next day, Celaena walked alongside Cale through the castle corridors, lost in her thoughts. Despite spending the previous night in Nehemia's company, she felt troubled by what had happened with Cain and the creature he had summoned. Meanwhile, Cale, unaware of what was going on in her mind, questioned her about her relationship with Dorian, showing concern for both of them. During their training session, tensions eased a bit. Cale and Celaena shared jokes and laughter, a light reprieve in the midst of the darkness looming over them. However, that calm was short-lived, as turning a corner, they suddenly found themselves face to face with the King of Adarlan, a presence that brought with it a heavy burden of uncertainty and danger. Chapter 44. The encounter with the king was as terrifying as it was unexpected. The imposing monarch, of massive build, advanced down the corridor towards Celaena and Chaol, who immediately stopped to make a deep bow. Celaena, following his example, bowed as well, though fear pounded in her chest. When she looked up, her eyes met the king's, and a shiver ran through her as she felt him trying to scrutinize her insides, as if he suspected something was amiss, that she was harboring dangerous secrets. As the king walked away, a dark unease settled over Celaena. Her thoughts turned to Cain, to the dark powers he had summoned, and to the possibility that the king might come to master such forces. The coldness emanating from the monarch reminded her of the void she had felt before the portal opened by Cain, a sensation that seemed to come from a dead and desolate world. What was Celaena planning by bringing her closer to the king, the man capable of destroying everything? Chaol noticed the change in Celaena but said nothing. They walked in silence for the rest of the way, with her clinging to his side, seeking the security he represented. Later, Chaol was in his room, reviewing a report detailing the king's mysterious journey. Even more intriguing was the lack of details about how an entire company had perished in the White Fang Mountains. The king's account suggested that the rebels had poisoned the supplies, but the vagueness of the report only heightened Chaol's suspicion. As captain of the guard, it was concerning that the sovereign did not fully trust him. As he reflected on Celaena, Chaol recalled how frightened she had been in the king's presence. Despite her bravery in combat and her prowess as a champion, the king reduced her to a small and vulnerable figure. Celaena was formidable, capable of killing anyone, even Cain, in the blink of an eye. However, Chaol couldn't help but think about the consequences of her victory in the tournament. How could they allow such a dangerous assassin to go free? The king had returned from his trip as abrupt as ever, but his behavior and the strange circumstances of his return troubled Chaol. Something dark was brewing, and Celaena had sensed it too. However, Chaol knew he should not interfere in the king's affairs. His priority should be solving the champion murders and ensuring that Celaena won the tournament, for he knew she would not survive another year in Endovier. With a bitter smile, Chaol thought of the impact Celaena had had on the castle during the few months she had been there. He couldn't imagine what might happen in the next 4 years if she managed to win. Chapter 45. Celaena and Nox panted after an exhausting sword training, while Brello, the weapons master, ordered them to take a break for water. The last test before the final duel was a day away, and the tension in the air was palpable. Celaena remained on high alert, especially toward Cain, whose mere presence deeply unsettled her. Cain, with his imposing physique and sinister smile, seemed to possess a dark power, something related to the mysterious black ring he wore on his hand. As she tried to push thoughts of Cain aside, Nox, ever observant, noticed the new scars on Celaena's hand and couldn't help but question her. Although she tried to evade the questions, Nox was not easily fooled and expressed his concern. The conversation turned serious when Celaena, with a mix of warning and advice, suggested that Nox leave the castle while he still had the chance. As they exchanged words, Nox began to deduce Celaena's true identity, finally realizing that she was not merely a jewel thief, but someone much more dangerous, with a dark past in the salt mines of Endovier. Shocked by the revelation and aware of the danger they faced, Nox decided to follow Celaena's advice. Despite the gravity of the situation, he asked Celaena for one favor before leaving, to eliminate Cain in the duels. That same night, Nox disappeared from the castle without saying goodbye to anyone. Meanwhile, Celaena felt the effects of the opium coursing through her body, making her more vulnerable to Cain's influence, whom she encountered in the castle corridors. The sight of Cain mingled with shadows and invisible creatures that seemed to lurk around him, leaving Celaena in a state of total bewilderment. However, upon reaching her destination, the strange visions faded, along with her memory of them. Later, Celaena was in the company of Dorian, enjoying a game of chess. Although they maintained a close relationship and had shared a passionate kiss during the ball, Celaena was determined not to involve him in the dangers surrounding her, especially those related to Cain and the dark creatures he could summon. Despite Dorian's attempts to get closer to her, Celaena remained cautious, aware that any revelation could put him in grave danger. After a long night of kisses and conversations with Dorian, Celaena was left alone, too nervous to sleep. Remembering the horrors she had faced and fearing what might happen in the coming days, the assassin prepared for a night of insomnia, aware that Cain was a constant threat. Finally, after a disturbing dream in which she was chased by a monstrous creature, Celaena awoke with a start. Realizing she had survived another night, she felt relieved. Soon she would learn that the last test had been cancelled, and in 2 days, she would face her adversaries in the final duels. Her fate was at stake, and she knew she had to be prepared for anything that might happen. Chapter 46. The next day, Dorian rode alone through a frozen and silent forest, where snow fell heavily from the trees. The young prince, who normally found hunting an escape from his worries, couldn't stop thinking about Celaena. Her face, her gestures, everything about her had taken over his mind. He felt she awakened in him a deep desire to do great things, to be worthy of the crown he might one day wear, all to impress her. However, despite the intense kiss they had shared, Dorian couldn't be sure what she truly felt for him. Accustomed to the adoration of other women, Celaena seemed to toy with him, like a cat with a mouse, which only confused him further. As he advanced through the forest, a deer appeared among the trees, but Dorian, instead of shooting, dropped the bow, unable to concentrate on the hunt. The next day, Celaena would duel, and the mere thought that something might happen to her was unbearable. Although he knew she was strong and capable, the uncertainty about her fate consumed him. Unable to bear those thoughts any longer, Dorian continued his ride, letting the snow and cold winter air try to cool his anxieties. Meanwhile, Celaena stood alone, facing the doors of her balcony, looking out over the city of Rifthold. Snow covered the rooftops, and the lights from the windows shone in the darkness, creating a scene that should have been beautiful but only reminded her of the corruption and evil that ruled that place. With a mix of anxiety and determination, Celaena thought about the impending duel against Cain. She had never had the chance to train with him, but she knew that, although he was strong, her advantage lay in her speed and agility. However, she couldn't help but feel a latent fear for what was at stake. Her thoughts wandered to a darker place, the dilemma of her fate. Would it be more honorable to die in the duel than to return to Endovier or become the king's champion, carrying out orders that might go against her principles? She remembered the days when, as Adarlan's assassin, she at least had some autonomy to choose her jobs, refusing to kill children or people from Terrasen. But now, if she won, she would be at the king's mercy, and the orders she would receive might be impossible to carry out without betraying everything she had once stood for. Celaena also reflected on how much she had changed since she was taken from Endovier by Captain Cale Westfall. She never would have imagined then that certain people, and not just freedom, would come to mean so much to her. Now, as she faced the possibility of leaving the castle, she realized that part of her wanted to stay, and that desire further complicated her already uncertain future. With the duel in sight, Celaena knew that not only her life was at stake, but also her heart and her loyalty to the new bonds she had forged in that place. Chapter 47. Celaena, wrapped in a luxurious red cloak, tried to ignore the biting cold as she waited for the duel that would decide Celaena's fate to begin. The frigid air was relentless, and the young lady shivered despite her attempts to stay composed. Her thoughts were focused on the small vial in her pocket, which contained a poison intended to weaken Celaena during the fight. As her fingers caressed the vial, Celaena glanced at the goblets arranged on the table, making sure to identify the one meant for Sardothien. It was crucial not to make a mistake. Harrington, unaware of Celaena's true plans, approached her as they watched the dueling grounds. The Duke, with a slight smile, kissed Celaena's hand, giving her the opportunity to discreetly pour the contents of the vial into Celaena's goblet. Just a few drops, enough to stun the assassin and ensure Kane's victory, Harrington's champion. The silence of the cold outdoors was interrupted by Celaena's arrival, escorted by 2 guards. Celaena watched her with a mix of disdain and curiosity. Though Celaena wore masculine clothes, there was something in her bearing that made her appear imposing. On the other side, Kane, with his formidable figure and red and gold royal guard attire, waited confidently as the icy wind tousled his short hair. Meanwhile, Celaena tried not to shiver as she stood in the overlook where the duel would take place. The cold was intense, and the icy wind cut through her fur-lined jacket. She approached Cale, seeking some human warmth in the frigid atmosphere. When the captain explained that the king had decided the duels would be held outdoors, Celaena could only nod, feeling the tension rise. In the distance, Celaena watched her with a mysterious smile, and Celaena couldn't help but wonder what schemes lay behind that expression. However, her thoughts were interrupted when Kane, with his intimidating figure and ornate sword, moved toward the center of the circle. As she watched him, Celaena wondered how much power Kane had accumulated, how much strength stolen from the lives of the murdered champions. The king stood, and the air seemed to freeze even more. When his voice echoed over the overlook, announcing the rules of the duel, Celaena felt her nerves tighten. Kane would face Renaud first, while she waited for her turn against Grave. Although she tried to concentrate, the memories of the past weeks, the dangers she had faced, kept her in a constant state of alert. As she watched the fight between Kane and Renaud, Cale murmured some strategies to Celaena, pointing out Kane's weaknesses. However, the fight was brief. Kane, with his superior strength and brutal skill, defeated Renaud in a few minutes, leaving the mercenary lying on the ground. The polite applause that followed only increased the tension in the air. Now, it was Celaena's turn. When the king gave the order to prepare, Cale offered her his own sword, a gesture that did not go unnoticed by Celaena. However, before she could accept it, Nehemia approached with her wooden staff, insisting she use it in the duel. The Princess of Alwi reminded her that the weapon represented more than just wood. It symbolized her people's struggle and the hope for justice. Celaena took the staff, grateful for the support from Nehemia and Cale. She knew the fight would be difficult, but the staff gave her the emotional strength she desperately needed. With one last look at Cale, who wished her luck, Celaena stepped into the circle to face Grave. As she approached her opponent, the assassin greeted him with a quick bow and then assumed a combat stance, gripping the staff with both hands. As Grave drew his sword, Celaena smiled confidently, knowing he had no idea what awaited him. Chapter 48. Grave, with fury blazing in his eyes, immediately lunged at Celaena, aiming to break the staff with his sword. But the assassin dodged him with agility, spinning around to strike him in the spine with the staff's end. Grave staggered, but didn't lose his balance, quickly turning to attack again. Celaena blocked his charge, deflecting Grave's blade with the staff, and used the momentum to strike him in the face. A well-aimed blow that broke his nose, forcing him to retreat. Despite the pain and the blood pouring from his nose, Grave didn't give up. With a cry of rage, he launched another attack, but Celaena, with a combination of strength and speed, dodged and counterattacked, finally bringing him to the ground. With the staff pointed at his throat, Celaena leaned over him, whispering her true name in his ear, a declaration that left Grave speechless. After this display of superiority, Celaena left the circle and approached Cale, who greeted her with a mix of admiration and relief. Though barely out of breath, her gaze was already fixed on the next duel, knowing Cain would be her next opponent. The brief pause was interrupted by the king, who ordered a toast for the winners. Celaena, with an enigmatic smile, presented the goblets to Cain and Celaena, who drank without suspecting what awaited them. With the goblet empty, Celaena handed it back to Celaena, who withdrew as the king ordered the start of the final fight. Despite the brief pause, she was not allowed to rest, which even surprised Dorian, who looked at his father with concern. Cain, with a mocking smile, was already ready for the fight, while Celaena, feeling her vision start to blur, tried to maintain her composure. As the duel began, Cain attacked with brutal force. Celaena, though fighting with all her might, noticed something was wrong. Her body felt heavy, her movements slow, and her mind began to cloud. Despite her efforts, Cain seemed to anticipate her every move, mocking her as he gradually weakened her. The assassin, increasingly disoriented, began to realize she had been drugged. Cain's figure distorted before her eyes, and hallucinations began to dominate her mind. Amid this chaos, Cain repeatedly knocked her down, his superior strength taking advantage of every moment of Celaena's weakness. The assassin, in her weakened state, could barely defend herself, her attacks lacking the strength and precision needed to counter him. As she fell again and again, Cain continued to dig into her mind, mentioning details of her past that no one should know. The psychological torture was as intense as the physical, and Celaena began to lose hope. On the brink of collapse, it was Cale's voice that managed to break through the fog in her mind. Though everything seemed lost, the captain of the guard, standing at the edge of the circle, called out to her with a mix of pain and hope. His words, simple but loaded with meaning, urged her to get up, to not give up. With an almost superhuman effort, Celaena began to rise, focusing solely on Cale's gaze, which represented her only source of strength at that moment. But just as it seemed she might rise completely, Cain struck her again, throwing her against the clock tower. This time, darkness enveloped her completely, taking her to a world of hallucinations where monsters and beings from another world harassed her. As her mind plunged into chaos, Cain continued to attack her, reveling in her suffering. In the midst of this nightmare, Celaena's amulet was torn from her neck, plunging her even further into the darkness. The monsters that harassed her multiplied, and she, with no strength left to defend herself, found herself at the mercy of the horrors that surrounded her. Cain, with his malicious grin, seemed determined to prolong her agony, savoring every moment of her torment. As reality and hallucination blurred in her mind, Celaena struggled to stay conscious, to find a way out of this nightmare. But everything seemed lost, and her mind, weakened by the poison, sank deeper and deeper into despair. Chapter 49. Dorian watched in horror as Celaena writhed on the ground, as if fighting invisible enemies. Something was very wrong. Had she been poisoned? His eyes shifted to Cain, who, with a malevolent smile, looked at the assassin with a satisfaction that chilled the blood. Could there be something in that place that only they could see? Celaena's scream, heart-wrenching and filled with suffering, was enough to send a shiver down Dorian's spine. Desperate, Dorian turned to Cale, who also watched the scene with wide eyes, paralyzed by panic. Celaena continued to fight on the ground, throwing punches at the air, while Cain calmly approached and struck her in the mouth, causing blood to spill. The situation was unbearable, but Dorian knew that any interference could mean Celaena's defeat. As Cain slowly approached, Nehemia appeared beside Dorian, her breathing fast and ragged. With fierce determination, she approached the edge of the circle, tracing symbols in the air with an almost supernatural speed. Meanwhile, Celaena, panting and disoriented, struggled to stay conscious. Her lost gaze and pale skin showed she was on the verge of collapse. Kneeling on the ground, trapped in a nightmare of hallucinations, Celaena could barely distinguish reality. The dead surrounded her, whispers and voices harassed her, while Cain, a dark and threatening figure, approached with the intention of finishing what he had started. Desperate, she tried to find a way out, but the darkness enveloped her completely. Suddenly, something extraordinary happened. Invisible doors swung open, and from another world, Celaena appeared, wrapped in a brilliant golden light. Her hair glowed like a star, and her presence was so imposing that even Cain, with his dark power, seemed to waver. The ancient queen launched herself at Cain, knocking him down with surprising force, while the demons surrounding Celaena vanished before her protective light. Celaena approached the assassin, who was on the verge of collapse, and took her in her hands, whispering that she couldn't give her strength, but she could purge the poison that weakened her. As she did, Cain tried to recover, but the wind Celaena had conjured kept him on the ground, his sword thrown to the other end of the overlook. The light emanating from Celaena began to dispel the darkness, and the poison that was poisoning Celaena's mind and body started to fade. Although Cain, accompanied by the evil force that possessed him, tried to break the barrier separating them, Celaena faced him with a bright blue light that destroyed him momentarily, though not completely. Celaena, exhausted but determined, urged Celaena to rise. The assassin, feeling the pain and clarity starting to return, reached out to grab the remains of the staff that had rolled near her. Despite the intensity of the pain, the poison was disappearing, and with it, the terrifying visions. With a final whisper of breath and hope, Celaena disappeared, and the world returned to its place. Cain's figure materialized before Celaena, but this time, he was just a man, without the shadows that had surrounded him before. Although she was injured, bleeding, and exhausted, Celaena, trembling but determined, rose once more, ready to face Cain and finish the duel once and for all. Chapter 50. Celaena was on the brink of collapse, her right leg barely supporting her, but with fierce determination, she stood up, facing Cain. The wind caressed her face, and her golden hair billowed like a shining cape behind her. A blue mark glowed on her forehead, and although Cain noticed it, he didn't understand its significance. The king, frowning, watched the scene while Nehemia held her breath, aware of the tension filling the air. With one arm nearly useless from pain, Celaena wiped the blood from her face just as Cain, with a growl, tried to decapitate her. However, she was faster, lunging forward and driving the jagged end of the staff into Cain's right side, just as Cale had instructed. Cain, surprised, staggered as blood poured from his wound. The pain and fear disappeared from Celaena's mind as she attacked mercilessly. With lethal precision, she wounded Cain in both arms, leaving him vulnerable. When he tried to charge her, she dodged, causing him to fall to the ground. With a show of authority, she placed a foot on his back, aiming the end of the staff at his throat, threatening to kill him if he moved. For a moment, she considered ending him to prevent him from revealing the secrets he knew about her and the word marks. However, she held back and looked up at the king, awaiting his verdict. The silence that followed was unbearable, but finally, the king declared Celaena the winner. She had won, she had survived, and now she was closer to freedom. As the recognition of her victory flooded her, she dropped the bloodied staff and limped away. She was safe, and a slight smile appeared on Nehemia's lips before she fainted. Celaena also collapsed, exhausted, as Dorian rushed to her side. Cain, bleeding profusely, watched the scene with fury. Dorian, aware of Celaena's critical state, desperately called for a healer, while Cain, secretly, drew a dagger to stab her in the back. Cale, realizing the betrayal, launched himself without hesitation and plunged his sword into Cain's heart, ending his life. Cain's dark blood, emanating a smell of death and decay, covered Cale, leaving him in shock as he realized he had just killed a man. While Dorian tried to comfort Celaena, overwhelmed by pain and exhaustion, Cale walked away, unable to comprehend what he had done. Dorian, feeling a mix of self-loathing for not intervening sooner and deep love for Celaena, carried her to her quarters, determined to protect her from any threat, no matter the consequences. Meanwhile, Celaena watched the scene in despair. She couldn't understand how Celaena had survived the poison she had administered, and her frustration turned toward Duke Parrington. In a fit of rage, she confronted him, revealing her involvement in the poisoning. But the Duke coldly betrayed her, denying any involvement and ordering the guards to arrest her. Celaena, trapped in a snare she had helped prepare, was dragged out of the hall as her dreams of power and glory completely faded away. Chapter 51. The next day, Dorian faced the imposing figure of his father, the King of Adarlan, with a defiant posture and chin held high. Despite the tense silence that lingered in the room, the prince refused to avert his gaze. The fury over how Cain had hurt Celaena still burned within him, but he had come before the king with a clear purpose. Finally, the king broke the silence, and Dorian, without hesitation, asked about Cale's fate after killing Cain. The monarch, with a spark of severity in his eyes, challenged his son to say what he thought should happen. Dorian defended Cale, arguing that he had acted in defense of Celaena and did not think it fair to punish him. The king, with a sarcastic tone, asked if the life of an assassin was worth more than that of a soldier. Dorian, undeterred, insisted that it was not honorable to kill someone from behind after a fair victory. The king, stroking his beard, posed a provocative question. If he himself tried to kill Celaena, would Dorian stop him? The prince, cautious, replied that he would trust his father's reasons, though his tone betrayed his discomfort. The king, apparently satisfied, decided not to punish Cale, and Dorian, despite his relief, couldn't stop worrying about the nature of this clemency. Then, Dorian expressed concern about Celaena's fate, but the king, with a cruel smile, questioned her worth as a champion, even suggesting sending her back to Endovier. The prince, in a burst of frustration, defended Celaena's strength, insisting that she was not a monster but a survivor. However, the king, noticing Dorian's fear of losing her, seemed to enjoy his anguish and decided to postpone the decision regarding the assassin's future, warning his son to keep his mouth shut. Dorian, enraged, thought of Nehemia and the staff she had given Celaena before the duel. The Princess of Alwi was shrewd, and Dorian admired her courage in facing a dangerous game against Adarlan. Determined to take a first step toward resistance, Dorian mentioned that Parrington had suggested holding Nehemia hostage to control the Alwi rebels. The king, intrigued, asked his son's opinion. Dorian, controlling his fear, argued that such an action would be too risky and could provoke a larger rebellion. After a moment of deliberation, the king agreed to his request and ordered Parrington to abandon the plan, leaving Dorian with a sense of relief mixed with determination. In her quarters, Celaena woke up wrapped in pain, her body covered in bandages and bruises. The agony was so intense she could barely move. As she tried to piece together her memories of the duel, she realized she had survived, though nightmares had tormented her during the night. She wondered about Elena's amulet, believing its absence was the cause of her unease. Nehemia entered the room, and though the assassin tried to remain calm, her friend's arrival comforted her. The princess approached and, with unusual sincerity, confessed that she had saved Celaena during the duel. Nehemia revealed that she had used the word marks to summon Celaena, the first queen of Adarlan, who came to Celaena's aid. She also admitted that she had pretended not to understand the common tongue to protect herself and that her knowledge of the word marks was deep, an ancestral secret of her family. Nehemia explained that Cain had used the word marks to summon demons and that she had been secretly fighting these creatures, which had distracted her at times. The princess had drawn protective symbols under Celaena's bed, which had shielded her from those beings. Cain, by invoking these dark powers, had transformed into something inhuman, and Nehemia suspected that the evil he had unleashed had corrupted his soul. When the conversation turned to the strange symbol that had appeared on Celaena's forehead during the duel, Nehemia confessed that she didn't know what it was, but she had seen it before and feared what the king might think if he discovered it. Celaena, for her part, decided to trust Nehemia, and both agreed not to keep any more secrets from each other. Before leaving, Nehemia returned Celaena's eye to Celaena, which one of the guards had retrieved after the duel. With the amulet in her hand, Celaena, despite the pain and confusion, allowed herself to fall into the deepest sleep she had had in a long time. Chapter 52. The next day, Celaena awoke with a vague sense of unease. The knocks on the door made her blink to clear her mind just as Dorian entered her room. He watched her from the doorway, and despite the pain that gripped her, she gave him a smile. The prince approached slowly, concerned by the tired expression on Celaena's face. She remembered how Dorian had carried her in his arms the night before, how he had stayed by her side while the healers worked on her wounds. As he approached, he quietly commented that she seemed worse than the day before. Though her entire body ached, Celaena tried to reassure him with a lie, claiming she was fine, but the pain was undeniable. Every breath sent a sharp pang through her ribs, broken by Cain's brutal attack. Dorian, gazing out the window, seemed lost in his thoughts. Celaena tried to reach him, but the pain prevented her from moving with agility. The prince, visibly distressed, confessed that he hadn't been able to sleep since the duel. Celaena invited him to sit next to her, and though Dorian was reluctant at first, he finally sank into the bed. Immersed in silence, Dorian let out heavy sighs, and Celaena, with a timid touch on his back, tried to offer comfort. Dorian confessed that he felt overwhelmed by what had happened. Celaena, worried about him, asked what tormented him so much. Dorian, his voice still tinged with guilt, expressed his remorse for not acting when he saw Celaena was in danger, for not stopping Cain before he hurt her. Though he tried to remain strong, his fear and guilt were palpable. Celaena, wanting to ease his burden, assured him that he shouldn't feel responsible. He had done what he was supposed to, staying on the sidelines so as not to jeopardize his participation in the competition. The prince, however, couldn't shake the guilt, lamenting that he hadn't been the one to kill Cain. Celaena, in an attempt to cheer him up, joked that he was beginning to sound like a hired assassin. Dorian smiled weakly and, with a sigh, settled beside her, wrapping an arm around her. The assassin curled up against him, finding comfort in the warmth he radiated, and both remained silent, listening to each other's heartbeat. As the warmth of the moment enveloped Celaena, Dorian confessed that from the moment he saw her in Endovier, he knew she would win the competition. He told her that, despite how twisted the idea of the tournament had been, he was glad it had been held because, thanks to it, she had entered his life. Celaena, moved by his words, looked at him with affection. Dorian, feeling the connection that had grown between them, leaned in and kissed her, despite the pain that still lingered in the assassin's body. Meanwhile, in the glass throne room, the king of Adarlan reflected on the situation with an impenetrable expression. Beside him, Duke Parrington waited, kneeling. Although Celaena had won the tournament and become his champion, The king had yet to hand her the official contract. The closeness of the assassin to Dorian and Princess Nehemia made him question whether it was wise to trust her. Even so, with Cain dead, Celaena was his best option, and her power and skill were undeniable. The king traced a mark on the armrest of his throne, contemplating the unknown symbol that had appeared on Celaena's forehead during the duel. It was an enigma he couldn't ignore, and if it proved to be a threat, he wouldn't hesitate to execute her before sunset. He had felt the presence of dark forces during the combat, forces that both attacked and protected Celaena. Nevertheless, he decided there were more urgent matters to address before making any decisions regarding her. Turning his attention back to Parrington, the king praised the Duke's manipulation of Celaena, though he questioned whether he had used his power over her. Parrington, playing with his black ring, denied having done so recently, explaining that Celaena was already quite weakened. The king, intrigued by the potential of this power, considered using it on more people to explore its limits. Parrington, despite his reservations, agreed to continue the experiments, though he expressed some pity for what Celaena had suffered. The king, however, was ruthless. He ordered Parrington to prepare everything for the next phases of his plan and warned him to stop talking about holding Nehemia hostage, as it was attracting too much attention. With a bow, the Duke left the hall, leaving the king in the shadows, meditating on the intrigues and dark powers beginning to unfold in his kingdom. Chapter 53. Celaena was in her room, resting in a chair balanced on its back legs, with her feet propped up on the table. Though her muscles were still stiff, she enjoyed the feeling of stretching them as she turned a page of the book in her hands. Legera, her little dog, dozed under the table, emitting soft snores. Outside, the afternoon sun melted the snow, flooding the room with bright reflections. Though her wounds no longer bothered her as much, Celaena still limped slightly when she walked, hoping she could run again soon. A week had passed since the duel. Philippa, her maid, was busy reorganizing the wardrobe to make room for the dresses Celaena planned to buy as soon as she could go out alone to Rift Hold, and started receiving the generous salary that came with being the king's champion. However, the contract confirming her new status had yet to be signed. During that week of recovery, Nehemia and Dorian had taken turns attending to her. Dorian even stayed up reading with her until late into the night. When she finally fell asleep, often with Dorian by her side, Celaena dreamed of ancient worlds and forgotten faces, of word marks and armies of the dead raised from the realms of hell. But every morning, she struggled to forget those images, especially the ones related to magic. The sudden snap of the door broke her thoughts, making her startle. Her heart raced at the thought that perhaps the time had come to sign the king's contract. However, seeing who entered, the world seemed to stop. It was Cale. Legera ran to him, wagging her tail with enthusiasm. Celaena almost lost her balance as she hastily pulled her feet off the table, feeling a sharp pain in her thigh as she stood up. She was left speechless as Cale stood in the doorway. Cale petted Legera's head, and then the little dog returned to her place under the table, leaving Celaena unsure of what to say or do. She noticed him looking at her legs, but not with admiration, rather at the bandage still on her thigh. In a soft voice, Cale asked about her wounds, and she quickly assured him she was fine, though she knew it wasn't entirely true. It felt like an eternity had passed since she last saw him, and when she asked if everything was okay, Cale's response was simple but loaded with an emotion Celaena couldn't quite decipher. When he apologized for not visiting her sooner, she tried to downplay his absence, saying he must have been busy. As she got closer to him, she noticed the sadness in Cale's eyes, a sadness that took her back to the duel, to that moment when, lying on the ground surrounded by chaos, she had found solace in the captain's presence as he offered her his hand to help her up. That moment had meant something, though she didn't fully understand what. Chaol, for his part, tried to steer the conversation away, excusing himself to go to a meeting. But when Celaena thanked him for killing Cain, he tensed up. He confessed that, despite having done his duty, the ease with which he had killed Cain deeply disturbed him. Cain knew things about Celaena's parents, something that troubled him even more. Although she knew that Cain had gained that knowledge through access to other realms, she preferred to keep that information to herself, lying to Chaol by saying she didn't know. Chaol's expression softened as he expressed his sorrow over her parents' death, and Celaena, though pretending to brush it off, couldn't help but remember every detail of their faces. Chaol couldn't stop thinking about what he had done, and when Celaena tried to thank him once again, he tried to leave. However, she stopped him, grabbing his hand and, in a sudden impulse, hugged him tightly. Chaol, initially uncomfortable, finally gave in and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. Celaena found immense peace in that embrace, one that made her wish to stay there forever while the world crumbled around her. The moment was interrupted by Dorian, who appeared at the door, asking if everything was okay. Chaol quickly stepped away from Celaena, immediately standing at attention. The atmosphere chilled instantly, and although Dorian tried to hide it, it was clear he had noticed the closeness between them. After a brief exchange, Chaol bid them both farewell and left the room. After Chaol's departure, Dorian shared the news he had come to deliver. The king had decided not to delay the signing of her contract any longer, and the next day, she would officially become the king's champion. Celaena, though excited by the news, couldn't help but think of Chaol and the way he had left the room. As Dorian hugged her, Celaena, still lost in her thoughts, realized what it meant to be the king's champion. Her relationship with Dorian could not continue. Despite Dorian's efforts to convince her they could keep their relationship a secret, Celaena, feeling the weight of her new responsibility and the promise of freedom in 4 years, decided she couldn't afford another secret in her life. She rejected the idea of continuing their relationship, though she assured him she wanted to remain friends. He, though clearly hurt, accepted her decision with a forced smile. When Dorian left, Celaena was left alone, staring out the window. As the sun shone outside, the word "free" echoed in her mind, bringing with it a mix of joy and relief. Finally, freedom was within reach, and she couldn't help but smile at the thought of what the future would hold. Chapter 54. Chaol stood in front of Celaena's quarters, lost in thought and tormented by the guilt he felt over Cain's death. Though Cain was nothing more than a pawn in the king's games, Chaol knew it had been his hand that killed him, and that responsibility consumed him. He had searched for Dorian without success and, on impulse, decided to visit Celaena. When he entered the dining room, he found her dining, relaxed and carefree. The conversation began casually, but quickly took a more serious turn when Celaena informed him she had ended her relationship with Dorian, explaining that as the king's champion, maintaining a romance with the prince would be inappropriate. Chaol, surprised but also relieved, tried to hide the joy that news brought him. Though both carried heavy burdens, they shared a moment of camaraderie as they toasted to the future, each hiding their own fears and doubts behind smiles and furtive glances. Later, Celaena found herself in a recurring dream, in which she visited Elena's tomb. With no trace of the Ritterak, the queen appeared, now without armor, and they talked about Celaena's recovery. Elena, with a mix of sadness and determination, revealed that history had forgotten many things about her, including her fight alongside Gavin against Erawan. Though legends depicted her as a damsel, Elena had been a warrior. Elena reminded Celaena that she had a greater destiny, that she was meant for great things, and though Celaena claimed she had fought only for her freedom, the queen knew there was more behind her actions. Elena's words resonated deeply with Celaena, especially when the queen mentioned that she had awakened from her sleep by the clamor of many voices needing help, and that Celaena too would have to respond to those calls someday. Elena urged her to enjoy her present, but made it clear that there was a greater purpose for which she was there, beside the king, though Celaena did not yet fully understand it. Before leaving, Celaena thanked Elena for saving her life, and the queen, with a sad gesture, reminded her that blood ties are unbreakable before fading into the darkness. Chapter 55. The next day, Celaena approached the glass throne, feeling a mix of tension and determination. This time, the council chamber was imposing, with 13 men seated around a long table, all with their eyes fixed on her. The greenish fire burning in the fireplace seemed like a watchful monster. Dorian, standing next to his father, gave her a smile that, though it promised hope, couldn't alleviate the fear that gripped her heart as she felt the king's gaze upon her. Upon reaching the center of the room, she bowed alongside Cale, who stayed so close to her that she could almost feel his protection. The king broke the silence with a cold, authoritative voice, demanding she sign her contract as champion. Celaena, trying to hide her fear and thoughts, responded with submission, promising to serve without questioning any orders, though she knew this would chain her to the king and his dark designs for long years. The monarch, rising from his throne, approached her, imposing his presence like a threatening shadow. His words were a whispered poison. If she failed in any of her missions or didn't return, Cale's life would be the price to pay. And if she still didn't return, Nehemia's execution and that of her family would follow. Celaena understood at that moment that she was not only selling her soul, but any mistake would endanger those she loved. With a feeling of resignation, she took the pen and signed the contract, feeling that each letter was a blow to her own freedom. When she finished, the king dismissed her without further ado, while Dorian watched her with sadness in his eyes. Cale took her arm and led her out of the room, aware of the gravity of what had just happened. As they left the chamber, despite the weight of the situation, Celaena felt a strange lightness in her shoulders. As they walked through the corridors, Cale broke the silence with a smile, asking if she was happy. Celaena, with a mix of irony and sincerity, admitted that though she had sold her soul, yes, she was happy. Cale, enjoying the title that now accompanied her name, hinted that he knew about her first mission, but Celaena, seeking to prolong her moment of relief a bit longer, decided she would find out the next day. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the Throne of Glass. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like it, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. What would you do in Celaena's place? Do you think she could win the tournament? Leave your answers in the comments. We'd love to hear your opinion.